Chapter 1, Unit 1, The Global Tapestry. 1. Developments in East Asia from c. 1200 to c. 1450. Setting the stage, why East Asia matters. Imagine you're standing at the center of the most sophisticated, densely populated, and economically productive region on the planet around the year 1200. You're not in Europe. Europe is a patchwork of feudal kingdoms still recovering from centuries of instability. You're in East Asia, and specifically in China, which at this moment is arguably the most advanced civilization on Earth. Understanding what happens here between 1200 and 1450 is absolutely foundational, not just for Unit 1, but for everything that follows in AP World History Modern. Trade routes, cultural diffusion, technological exchange, all of it flows outward from this region. So let's dig in. The Song Dynasty and its legacy. By 1200, China is operating under the Song Dynasty, and you need to understand what made the Song so remarkable. Think of the Song as the Silicon Valley of the medieval world, a place where innovation was baked into the culture. The Song perfected and commercialized technologies that would eventually transform the entire globe: gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and woodblock printing. These aren't just fun trivia facts. On the AP exam, you will be asked to trace the diffusion of these technologies outward along trade networks, especially the Silk Roads and Indian Ocean routes. When you see a question about why European maritime exploration became possible in the 1400s and 1450s, part of your answer traces back to compass technology that originated in Song China. The Song also presided over an agricultural revolution centered on champa rice, a fast-ripening, drought-resistant strain imported from Vietnam. Think of it like switching from dial-up internet to fiber optic. Suddenly everything speeds up. Champa rice allowed farmers to harvest multiple crops per year, which fueled a dramatic population boom and generated agricultural surpluses that fed urban growth. This urbanization supported a vibrant commercial economy, and China under the Song developed some of the world's earliest paper money. That detail, paper money as a Song innovation, shows up on the MCQ regularly. Don't let it catch you off guard. The Mongol moment, conquest, and the Yuan dynasty. Here's where the timeline gets dramatic. In the early 13th century, Genghis Khan unifies the Mongol tribes on the steppe, and his descendants systematically conquer much of Eurasia. China falls to the Mongols in stages, northern China first, then the full conquest completed by Kublai Khan in 1279, who establishes the Yuan dynasty. This is one of the most important political transitions you need to understand for the exam. The Mongol conquest was devastating in terms of human cost, population decline, destruction of cities, disruption of agrarian life. But here's the counterintuitive part that the AP exam loves to test. The Mongol Empire, once consolidated, created the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. Think of it as the ancient world's version of a free trade zone stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Under Mongol protection, merchants, diplomats, and missionaries could travel the Silk Roads more safely than ever before. This is how figures like Marco Polo make it to China. This is how bubonic plague, carried by fleas on rats along those same trade routes, spreads westward and devastates Europe in the mid-14th century. The same network that carries silk and spices carries disease. That connection between Mongol trade facilitation and the Black Death is a classic AP linkage question. A common trap students fall into is assuming the Mongols destroyed everything and left nothing behind. Don't do that. Yes, they were militarily brutal, but their rule also facilitated massive cross-cultural exchange, and Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty actually adopted significant elements of Chinese bureaucratic culture. He kept Confucian-educated administrators in some roles, used the existing imperial infrastructure, and promoted commerce. The nuance matters on the DBQ and LEQ, where you'll need to argue that the Mongols were both disruptive and connective. The Ming Restoration and Confucian governance. After nearly a century of Mongol rule, the Yuan dynasty collapses, and the Ming dynasty rises in 1368. Though that's just outside our period, the transition is relevant. What you need to understand is the reaction against the Mongols, which takes the form of a vigorous reassertion of Chinese cultural identity and Confucian values. The Ming would go on to sponsor Zheng He's massive maritime voyages in the early 1400s, which is a critical topic for Unit 1 and connects directly to discussions of Indian Ocean trade networks. Confucianism, the civil service exam and social structure. Confucianism is the philosophical operating system of Chinese civilization during this entire period, and you need to be precise about what that means. Confucian thought organizes society around 5 key relationships: ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, elder sibling and younger sibling, friend and friend, all structured around hierarchy, reciprocity, and moral cultivation. This isn't abstract philosophy. It has concrete political consequences. It legitimizes the emperor's authority, shapes gender roles. Women are subordinated in Confucian family structures, and justifies the meritocratic civil service examination system. The civil service exam is something examiners love to test because it's genuinely unusual in world history. In a world where most political power was inherited, China had a system where educated men, regardless of birth, could theoretically rise to bureaucratic positions by passing rigorous exams based on Confucian classics. Think of it as a standardized test that determined your entire career. This system reinforced Confucian values, produced a scholar gentry class, and gave the imperial state a pool of capable administrators. On the exam, you might be asked to compare this system with European feudalism or Japanese social hierarchy. Know that the Chinese model was relatively more meritocratic, though in practice wealthy families still had advantages in education. Cross-unit connections you cannot ignore. Everything in this section ripples outward. Mongol trade facilitation connects to Unit 2's Indian Ocean and Silk Road networks. Chinese technological innovations connect to Unit 4's European exploration. The civil service exam and Confucian governance connect to Unit 3's comparative government structures. When you write an LEQ or DBQ, these aren't separate topics, they're a web, and East Asia from 1200 to 1450 is one of its most important anchoring points. As you move into the next section, you'll zoom out from East Asia to examine the broader tapestry of interconnected civilizations, because understanding how Dar al-Islam, the Americas, and sub-Saharan Africa were developing in this same period will help you see the world the way AP World History asks you to see it, as a system, not a collection of isolated stories. 1A Song Dynasty, Neo-Confucianism, Bureaucracy, and the Civil Service Examination System. Let's set the scene. It's somewhere around the year 1000 CE, and China under the Song Dynasty is arguably the most sophisticated, most literate, most administratively complex civilization on Earth. While Europe is fragmented into feudal kingdoms where your job title depends almost entirely on who your father was, China has built something genuinely revolutionary, a government staffed by educated merit, not by birthright. That idea that talent and knowledge should determine who governs is one of the most consequential political experiments in all of world history, and it starts right here in Unit 1. The Civil Service Examination System. Think of the Civil Service Examination System as the world's first high-stakes standardized test, except the stakes weren't getting into a good college, they were getting access to wealth, prestige, and political power. The exam system had roots going back to the Han Dynasty, but the Song Dynasty supercharged it. During the Song, the examinations became far more regularized, more competitive, and more genuinely open to men outside the aristocracy than ever before. Here's how it worked. The exams were organized in tiers, local, regional, and then the imperial exam held in the capital. Passing the highest level awarded you the title of Jinshi, which translates roughly as presented scholar, and that credential was your golden ticket into the bureaucracy. The content tested was almost exclusively classical Confucian texts. Candidates were expected to write essays, compose poetry in strict forms, and demonstrate deep mastery of works like the Analects and the writings of Mencius. Imagine spending a decade memorizing and interpreting a fixed canon of texts, then sitting in a tiny wooden booth for days writing answers. That was the reality for hundreds of thousands of aspirants. For the AP exam, you need to understand both what the system did and what it didn't do. What it did, it created a pathway for talented men from non-elite backgrounds to enter government service. gradually displacing the old aristocratic families who had dominated politics for centuries. What it didn't do, it was not truly egalitarian. Preparing for the exams required years of education, tutors, and texts, all of which cost money. In practice, wealthy families had enormous advantages, and women were entirely excluded. This nuance shows up constantly in AP multiple-choice traps. You'll see a question frame the exam system as either fully meritocratic or not meritocratic at all, and your job is to land in the sophisticated middle. It expanded access relative to aristocratic systems, but access remained deeply shaped by economic class. Neo-Confucianism, old ideas, new framework. Now let's talk about the philosophical engine running underneath all of this, because the exam system didn't just test any knowledge, it tested a very specific worldview. Enter Neo-Confucianism. And this term is one you absolutely must know cold for the AP exam. Neo-Confucianism was an intellectual movement, primarily associated with thinkers like Zhu Xi in the Song Dynasty, that revived and reinterpreted classical Confucian teachings by weaving in elements of Buddhist and Taoist metaphysics. Think of it like a software update. Classical Confucianism was version 1, focused on social relationships, ritual propriety, and ethical governance. Neo-Confucianism was version 2.0, asking deeper philosophical questions. What is the nature of reality? What is the relationship between human beings and the moral order of the universe? Zhu Xi synthesized these questions into a coherent system centered on the concept of lie, principle, or pattern, and qi, vital force or material energy, arguing that understanding the moral principles underlying all things was the path to ethical self-cultivation and good governance. Why does this matter for AP World History? Because Neo-Confucianism became the official ideological framework of the Chinese state, codified into the examination curriculum, and exported across East Asia to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. This is a huge cross-regional connection the AP exam loves to test. When you're studying the Joseon dynasty in Korea or aspects of Tokugawa Japan, Neo-Confucian influence is part of the story. The Song Dynasty doesn't just matter internally, it radiates outward. Bureaucracy and the scholar gentry class. The civil service system produced a social class that is absolutely central to understanding Chinese history from the Song period onward, the scholar gentry. These were educated landholding families whose status derived from success in the examination system. They were the connective tissue between the imperial court and local communities, handling tax collection, dispute resolution, infrastructure, and the maintenance of Confucian social norms at the ground level. A useful analogy: think of them as a combination of local politician, judge, and civic leader, all rolled into one and all legitimized by their scholarly credentials. The bureaucratic structure itself was built on Confucian principles of hierarchy and proper relationships. The 5 relationships, ruler to subject, parent to child, husband to wife, elder sibling to younger sibling, and friend to friend, provided the moral blueprint for how authority should flow: loyalty upward, benevolence downward. This framework justified both the emperor's authority and the bureaucrat's role as a moral exemplar in his community. Key exam traps and connections to watch for. A few critical distinctions to lock in before you move on. First, don't confuse Neo-Confucianism with Buddhism or Taoism. Neo-Confucianism absorbed elements of both but remained distinct. It was fundamentally focused on social ethics and governance, not on spiritual liberation or harmony with nature as ends in themselves. The AP exam has absolutely tested this boundary. Second, remember that the Song dynasty coexisted with significant military weakness. Despite its extraordinary cultural and economic achievements, the Song eventually fell to Mongol conquest in 1279. Brilliance in governance and culture does not automatically translate to military power, and this contrast is something the exam may ask you to analyze. In terms of cross-unit connections, everything you learn here about the scholar gentry and Neo-Confucianism will resurface when you study the Ming and Qing dynasties in later units, and again when analyzing how Confucian political culture shaped state-building across East Asia. The examination system also becomes a point of contrast when you study European feudal governance or Islamic administrative structures. The AP exam frequently asks you to compare methods of governance across civilizations. and the Song's meritocratic model is one of your strongest examples. When you're writing an FRQ about political systems or cultural continuity and change, the Song civil service system is a gift. It gives you a specific, well-documented institution with a clear mechanism, the exam, a clear ideology, Neo-Confucianism, and a clear social outcome, the scholar gentry class. Always connect the institution to the ideology to the social structure. That three-part chain is exactly what AP rubrics reward. With the Song Dynasty's political and philosophical architecture now firmly in your foundation, let's turn to the extraordinary economic and technological innovations that made the Song one of the most prosperous societies of the pre-modern world. 1.1b Tang Song Economic Revolution, Commercialization, Urbanization, and Agricultural Innovation. Setting the stage. Why this revolution matters. Imagine you're living in a small medieval village in Europe around the year 1000 CE. Your world is roughly 10 miles wide, the distance you can walk and return home in a day. You grow what you eat, you barter what you can't grow, and the idea of a marketplace buzzing with merchants from distant lands feels like a fairy tale. Now teleport yourself to Hangzhou, China, at roughly the same moment in history, and suddenly you're standing in a city of over 1 million people, surrounded by paper money, sophisticated banking instruments, and ships loaded with porcelain heading for Southeast Asia and the Persian Gulf. That contrast is the Tang Song economic revolution in a nutshell, and the College Board considers it one of the most significant transformations in all of world history before 1450. The AP exam will expect you to understand this revolution across 3 interlocking dimensions: agricultural innovation, commercialization, and urbanization. These aren't 3 separate stories. They're 3 chapters of the same story, each one making the next possible. Agricultural innovation, the engine that started everything. The foundation of everything that follows is the rice bowl, and more specifically, a particular kind of rice. The introduction of Champa rice, a fast-ripening, drought-resistant variety imported from the Champa Kingdom in what is today central Vietnam, is the single most important agricultural innovation you need to know for this topic. Champa rice could grow in drier, less fertile soil, and crucially, it matured so quickly that farmers in southern China could harvest 2 crops per year in the same field rather than 1. Think of it like upgrading from a single-income household to a dual-income household overnight. Suddenly, there's surplus, more food than the farmer's family needs, and surplus is the mother of everything that follows. Alongside Champa rice, Song-era China saw advances in iron agricultural tools and irrigation techniques, including expanded canal networks that moved water to previously unusable land. The result was that the Yangtze River Delta region, a swampy, difficult terrain that earlier dynasties had largely ignored, became the most productive agricultural zone in the world. If the AP exam asks you what geographical shift this represents, the answer is the movement of China's economic and demographic center of gravity from the north, the Yellow River Basin, which had dominated for centuries, to the south. That's a major geographic theme the College Board loves to test. Commercialization, when surplus becomes trade. Now that farmers are producing more food than they can eat, something transformative happens. People can specialize. A family doesn't need every member working the fields anymore. Someone can become a potter, a silk weaver, a blacksmith. This specialization of labor is the seed of commercialization, and the Song Dynasty watered it brilliantly. One of the most exam-critical innovations here is the development of paper money, called jiaozi in its early form, which evolved from merchant deposit certificates during the Tang Dynasty and became government-issued currency under the Song. Think of it like the invention of the credit card. Suddenly commerce can happen at a scale that heavy metal coins simply couldn't support. Long-distance trade became dramatically easier. Alongside paper money, China developed letters of credit and sophisticated financial instruments that look remarkably like modern banking. The expansion of internal trade along China's vast canal and river networks deserves equal attention. The Grand Canal, linking the agricultural south to the political north, functioned like an interstate highway system for goods. This is a great example to use in an FRQ when discussing how infrastructure supports economic growth, a connection the College Board draws explicitly in the course framework. For the AP exam, You also need to recognize China's expansion of maritime trade. Song-era China produced enormous quantities of porcelain and silk for export, and Chinese merchants sailed increasingly sophisticated ships equipped with the magnetic compass, another Song-era innovation, to markets in Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa. When you encounter a primary source in the AP exam featuring a foreign merchant describing Chinese goods, or an archaeological find of Chinese porcelain in East Africa, your mental tag should be Song Dynasty commercialization driving the Indian Ocean trade network. Urbanization, the world's first modern cities. When you have agricultural surplus and thriving commerce, people move to cities. The Song Dynasty produced urban centers of staggering scale. Hangzhou, the southern Song capital, had a population that historians estimate between 1 and 2 million people, larger than any city in medieval Europe by a factor of 10. These were not just administrative capitals. They were commercial hubs filled with restaurants, theaters, shops open at night. The Song Dynasty actually abolished earlier curfews on urban markets, and a growing merchant class whose wealth sometimes rivaled the aristocracy. This urbanization represents a critical social shift you must understand for the exam. In China's traditional Confucian social hierarchy, merchants ranked at the bottom below farmers, artisans, and of course, scholars and officials. Yet the Tang Song economic revolution began quietly elevating the practical status of merchants even as the official ideology still ranked them low. This tension between Confucian values and commercial reality is a recurring theme in AP World History and will appear in comparative questions about how different societies regarded commercial activity. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. The most common trap on multiple-choice questions is conflating the Tang and Song dynasties. Here's your rule. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, laid early groundwork. The Grand Canal was expanded, early merchant certificates emerged, but the full flowering of the economic revolution is a Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE story. If an answer choice attributes paper money or Champa rice adoption to the Tang dynasty, be skeptical. Another trap is assuming this revolution was primarily about foreign trade. Internal trade and domestic commercialization were equally, if not more important, and the exam loves to test that nuance. For FRQ responses, the College Board's rubric rewards specificity. Don't just write China had more trade. Write the adoption of Champa rice generated agricultural surplus in the Yangtze Delta, enabling labor specialization and the growth of merchant classes in Song urban centers like Hangzhou. That chain of causation is exactly what earns contextualization and evidence points. Connections across the course. This topic threads through the entire AP World exam. The maritime trade networks you see expanding here in Unit 1 become the backbone of Unit 2's Indian Ocean network. The Mongol conquests of the Song dynasty in Unit 2 will disrupt but also paradoxically spread Chinese innovations westward. In Unit 3, you'll compare this commercialization with early capitalism emerging in Europe, and the Confucian merchant tension mirrors debates in Islamic societies about the status of trade. Keep those threads visible in your mind, with the economic engine of Song China now running at full power in your understanding. Let's turn to another great civilizational hub of this era and explore the political and cultural world of the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate, a society that was in its own remarkable ways just as cosmopolitan and interconnected as Tang Song China. 1.1c The Rise of the Mongol Empire and the Yuan Dynasty in China. Let's talk about the most dramatic political transformation of the 13th century, a story that begins on the windswept steppes of Central Asia and ends with one family ruling the largest contiguous land empire in human history. If you've ever watched a small startup completely disrupt an established industry and take over the market in a decade, you have a rough analogy for what Genghis Khan and his successors pulled off between roughly 1206 and 1279. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend, and the AP exam loves to test whether you truly understand what made it possible, what it changed, and what it connected. The steppe context and Mongol origins. Start with geography, because the AP exam will expect you to think geographically. The Mongols emerged from the Eurasian steppe, a vast belt of grassland, stretching from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east. This environment shaped everything about Mongol society. They were pastoral nomads, meaning they moved seasonally with their herds rather than farming fixed land. Pastoral nomadism produced extraordinary horsemen, expert archers, and people who understood mobility as a survival strategy. Think of it like this. If your entire life trains you to move fast, coordinate across distance, and read landscape, you are accidentally building the perfect military skill set. Before Genghis Khan, the Mongol clans were fragmented, frequently raiding and fighting each other, not unlike rival gangs competing over territory. What Temujin, who would become Genghis Khan, accomplished was unification. Through a combination of military genius, strategic marriages, and the ruthless elimination of rival leaders, he consolidated the Mongol tribes and in 1206 was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, at a grand assembly called a Kurultai. This date, 1206, is one you absolutely need to know for the exam. It marks the formal founding of the Mongol Empire and becomes your baseline for every subsequent expansion. Military innovation and rapid expansion. Here is where students often oversimplify, and the AP exam will catch you if you do. The Mongols were not just good at cavalry charges. Their military success rested on genuine tactical innovation. They adopted siege technology from conquered peoples, particularly Chinese engineers, used psychological warfare deliberately and systematically, and organized their armies in a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. That made coordination and communication far more efficient than anything their enemies had. They also had extraordinary intelligence networks, gathering detailed information about enemies before attacking. Think of them less as a brute force army and more as a highly adaptive organization that continuously updated its toolkit. Genghis Khan's campaigns swept across Central Asia, Persia, and northern China. His successors, particularly his sons and grandsons, pushed those conquests further. By the time the empire reached its maximum extent in the late 13th century, it stretched from Korea to Poland, encompassing China, Persia, Russia, and Central Asia simultaneously. On the AP exam, you need to understand that this was not just military conquest. It fundamentally reorganized trade routes, population distributions, and political structures across the Eastern Hemisphere. The Yuan Dynasty, Conquest and Governance in China. Now let's zoom in on China because this is where the AP exam focuses most heavily for this section. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, completed the conquest of the southern Song Dynasty in 1279, establishing the Yuan Dynasty. This is a critical nuance students frequently miss. The Mongols had already controlled northern China for decades before this date, but 1279 marks the complete unification of China under Mongol rule. Keep those dates distinct. Kublai Khan faced a fundamental governance problem that you should be able to explain clearly. He was ruling a population of tens of millions of highly sophisticated, agriculturally based, bureaucratically experienced Chinese people with a relatively small population of nomadic conquerors. His solution involved a deliberate ethnic hierarchy. At the top sat the Mongols themselves. Below them were the Samuren, people with colored eyes, meaning Central Asians, Persians, and other non-Chinese foreigners who served as administrators and merchants. Below them were the Han Chinese of northern China, and at the bottom were the southern Chinese, the last conquered. This four-tier system is something the AP exam has tested directly, and it illustrates a key theme the College Board loves. How do conquerors maintain control over larger, more complex civilizations? Equally important is what Kublai Khan kept. He maintained the Chinese bureaucratic structure, used Chinese administrative practices, and even adopted Chinese cultural symbols of legitimacy, claiming the mandate of heaven, the traditional Chinese concept that rulers govern with divine approval and lose it when they govern badly. This is a classic example of the AP's continuity and change over time framework. Ask yourself what changed under Mongol rule and what persisted. The answer shapes nearly every FRQ about this period. The Pax Mongolica and cross-cultural exchange. One concept you absolutely cannot skip is the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Once the conquests stabilized, the Mongol Empire created something genuinely unprecedented: safe, connected trade routes from China to the Mediterranean. Merchants, diplomats, and missionaries could travel thousands of miles under the protection of a single political authority. Marco Polo's famous journey is the celebrity example, but the deeper point for the AP exam is systemic. The Silk Roads, which had always existed but were often fragmented by political instability, now functioned as an integrated network. Goods, ideas, technologies, and unfortunately diseases moved with a new efficiency. The Black Death, which you'll encounter again in Unit 2, traveled westward along these very routes. The Pax Mongolica is the direct causal link between Mongol political unification and the intensification of cross-cultural exchange that defines this entire period. Common exam traps and FRQ essentials. Watch out for a few classic wrong answer traps. First, don't confuse the founding of the Mongol Empire, 1206, with the establishment of the Yuan Dynasty, 1271, formalized with that name, full conquest, 1279. These are different events. Second, don't characterize the Mongols as purely destructive. Yes, they devastated cities like Baghdad in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate, another critical fact, but they also facilitated enormous cultural and commercial exchange. The AP exam rewards nuanced thinking. Third, students often forget that the Mongols were religiously tolerant across their empire, which enabled the diverse administrative system they relied on. For FRQs, always connect Mongol rule to the broader Unit 1 theme of cross-cultural exchange and tie the Yuan dynasty specifically to how outside rulers adapted to Chinese administrative traditions, a pattern that repeats with groups like the Manchu who later established the Qing dynasty. With that framework in place, conquest, governance, and the networks that resulted, you're ready to explore how those same Silk Road connections shaped the societies that sent goods and ideas flowing through them, which is exactly where we're headed next. 1D Chinese cultural and technological innovations and their diffusion, printing, gunpowder, compass. Why China was the innovation hub of the pre-modern world. Let's start with a big picture framing that will serve you well on the AP exam. During the period roughly spanning 600 to 1450 CE, the heart of Unit 1 and much of Unit 2, China wasn't just one civilization among many. It was, in many respects, the most technologically sophisticated society on Earth. The College Board wants you to understand not just what the Chinese invented, but how those inventions spread, who carried them, and what changed as a result. That chain, innovation, diffusion, transformation, is the intellectual backbone of this entire section. Think of it this way. China in the Tang and Song dynasties was like Silicon Valley, but for the entire medieval world. Ideas and technologies didn't stay in California. They spread globally and reshaped industries, politics, and power. Same principle applies here, just with ink and saltpeter instead of microchips. Printing. Information changes everything. Woodblock printing emerged in China during the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, and movable type was developed by Baisheng during the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE. Here's the key distinction the AP exam loves to test. Woodblock printing carves an entire page into a single block of wood, labor-intensive but reusable for that specific text. Movable type uses individual, rearrangeable characters, making it far more flexible for producing diverse texts. The critical takeaway for your exam is not the technical mechanics, but the consequences of printing. Cheaper reproduction of texts meant that Buddhist scriptures, Confucian classics, and agricultural manuals could circulate more widely, reinforcing cultural cohesion across a vast empire. The diffusion pathway matters enormously here. Printing technology moved westward along the Silk Roads, eventually reaching the Islamic world and, much later, Europe, where Gutenberg's press in the 1440s triggered the Protestant Reformation and the Scientific Revolution. When you see an FRQ asking you to trace the impact of Chinese innovations, always connect printing to the spread of ideas, religious, philosophical, and scientific, across Eurasia. A common MCQ trap is assuming that Gutenberg invented printing. He did not. He adapted and improved a technology with roots in China. If you see an answer choice that credits European originality here, That's almost certainly wrong. The correct framing emphasizes Chinese origin and cross-cultural diffusion. Gunpowder. From fireworks to firearms, gunpowder was discovered by Tang Dynasty alchemists, who were, ironically, searching for an elixir of immortality. They found something that would do quite the opposite to a lot of people. The Chinese initially used it for fireworks and early incendiary weapons, fire arrows, bombs, and eventually the fire lance, a precursor to the gun. By the Song Dynasty, Chinese armies were deploying gunpowder-based weapons in warfare against Jurchen and Mongol invaders. Here is where the diffusion story gets fascinating and exam relevant. The Mongol Empire, and this is crucial, acted as a massive transmission belt for technology across Eurasia. As the Mongols conquered and then administered territories from China to Persia to Eastern Europe, they carried gunpowder technology westward. Islamic states in the Middle East adapted it, and eventually it reached Europe, where it was refined into the cannons and muskets that would shatter feudal castle walls and overturn medieval military hierarchies. For the AP exam, the connection between gunpowder and the decline of feudalism in Europe is a Unit 1 to Unit 2 bridge you absolutely must know. When the nobility's castles stop being defensible against cannon fire, the entire social contract of feudal Europe starts to crack. That's a massive downstream consequence of a Chinese alchemical accident. For FRQ responses, this is gold. It demonstrates that you understand long-term causation, not just surface-level facts. Don't confuse the invention of gunpowder with the military transformation it caused. The Chinese invented it. The transformation of European and Middle Eastern warfare came later through diffusion and adaptation. That sequence is exactly what the College Board is testing. The compass, orienting a connected world. The magnetic compass was developed in China during the Han Dynasty for geomantic purposes, essentially feng shui, determining auspicious directions for buildings and graves. By the Song Dynasty, Chinese navigators were using it at sea, and this is where its world historical significance explodes. A reliable compass meant that sailors could navigate on overcast days and nights when stars were hidden. Open ocean navigation became dramatically safer. The compass diffused westward through Arab maritime traders, who were the dominant intermediaries of the Indian Ocean trade network. By the time European sailors adopted it in the 12th and 13th centuries, they had a tool that would eventually enable the voyages of Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan. Here you have a direct conceptual line from a Song Dynasty Chinese invention to the European age of exploration covered in Unit 4. When you encounter questions about why European oceanic exploration became possible when it did, the compass, along with the astrolabe and improved ship designs, is part of your answer. The AP exam frequently asks you to identify the agents of diffusion for Chinese technologies. For the compass, it's Arab traders operating in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. For gunpowder, it's the Mongols and their vast land empire. For printing, it's Buddhist monks and Silk Road merchants. Never just say it spread, always name who spread it and through what networks, because those specific details are what earn points on the FRQ. Bringing it together, the diffusion framework. The College Board wants you to think about Chinese innovations as evidence for two big themes: the sophistication of Song Dynasty China as a state, and the interconnectedness of Eurasia through networks like the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean trade system, and the Mongol Empire. These aren't isolated inventions, they're proof that no civilization develops in a vacuum. Technologies move through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, and they change shape as they travel. Gunpowder in Chinese hands meant fireworks and early guns. In European hands, it meant the end of feudal castles. That transformation during diffusion is a nuanced point that separates a 4 from a 5. One final misconception to clear up. Students sometimes assume that because China invented these technologies, China also reaped the greatest long-term benefits from them. That's not always true. Europe's adoption of the compass facilitated colonialism. Europe's use of gunpowder reshuffled global military power. China, meanwhile, faced Mongol invasion despite its own gunpowder weapons. The relationship between invention and power is complicated, and the AP exam rewards students who acknowledge that complexity. As we move deeper into Unit 1, you'll see how these same Chinese innovations connect to the flourishing of trade networks across Afro-Eurasia, networks that carried not just goods and technologies, but religions, diseases, and ideas across the entire connected world. 1E Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Political structures and the influence of Chinese models. Here's something to think about before we dive in. Imagine you're a small country sitting next to the most powerful civilization on Earth, a civilization with a sophisticated writing system, a highly organized bureaucracy, a rich philosophical tradition, and centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to govern. Do you adopt everything wholesale? Do you reject it all to protect your own identity? Or do you do something more nuanced, borrowing selectively, adapting what works, and quietly holding on to what makes you, you? That, in a nutshell, is the story of Japan, Korea, and Vietnam in the period from roughly 600 to 1450 CE, and it's one of the most intellectually rich topics on the AP World History exam. The framework: selective adoption, not total absorption. The College Board's key concept here is the influence of Chinese models, and that phrase is doing a lot of work. China under the Tang and Song dynasties represented perhaps the most sophisticated state in the world. Its neighbors couldn't ignore it. But what's crucial for your exam answers is that Japan, Korea, and Vietnam did not simply copy China. They selectively adopted elements of Chinese culture, governance, and philosophy, while maintaining distinct political structures and cultural identities. That tension between borrowing and retaining is the analytical engine of this entire topic. Think of it like a restaurant franchise. McDonald's might expand into Japan, but before long you've got teriyaki burgers and matcha McFlurries. The brand is recognizable, but it's been adapted to local taste. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam each did something similar with Chinese civilization. And the AP exam loves to ask you to identify what they borrowed, what they adapted, and what they deliberately kept different. Korea, the closest neighbor, the deepest influence. Korea, sharing a land border with China, had the most direct and sustained contact. The Korean kingdoms, particularly Silla, which unified the peninsula in the 7th century, and later Goryeo, absorbed enormous amounts of Chinese culture. Korean rulers adopted Confucian political philosophy, which emphasized hierarchical social order, loyalty to the ruler, and the moral responsibility of the educated elite to govern wisely. They also embraced Chinese Buddhism, which spread through Korea and became deeply embedded in court life. The Koreans even adopted a version of China's civil service examination system, the mechanism by which the Tang and Song dynasties selected government officials based on merit rather than birth alone. But here is your first major AP trap. Korea's exam system never fully displaced the aristocratic class system the way it theoretically did in China. In practice, Korea's powerful hereditary aristocracy, called the bone rank system under Silla, and later the aristocratic clans under Goryeo, still dominated political life. The exam existed alongside aristocratic privilege rather than replacing it. When you see an MCQ asking which society had the most genuinely merit-based bureaucracy, the answer is China, not Korea. Korea had the exam, but the old elite still ran the show. Japan, the most selective borrower. Japan's relationship with Chinese models is one of the most fascinating case studies in cultural borrowing in all of world history. Beginning with the Taika reforms of 645 CE and the later Nara and Heian periods, Japanese elites consciously imported Chinese institutions. They adopted Chinese writing, though they eventually adapted it to create their own phonetic scripts, hiragana and katakana, a perfect metaphor for their whole approach. They embraced Buddhism, Confucian ethics, Chinese architectural styles, and even tried to implement a centralized bureaucracy modeled on the Tang system. But Japan's trajectory diverged sharply from China in one critical way. Centralized bureaucratic power never took hold. By the late Heian period, and certainly by the rise of the shogunate system in the 12th century, real political power had shifted away from the imperial court and into the hands of a warrior aristocracy. The samurai class, led ultimately by the shogun. This is a system that has no real parallel in China. The emperor remained a symbolic figurehead, but effective governance was decentralized and militarized. Think of it like a constitutional monarchy where the monarch has been completely sidelined, except instead of a parliament taking over, it's a warlord. The AP exam will absolutely test whether you understand this distinction. Japan adopted the form of Chinese-style governance without allowing it to reshape underlying power structures. The aristocratic clans and later the warrior elite ensured that Japan remained politically distinct from China, even as its arts, religion, and writing showed deep Chinese influence. Vietnam. Resistance as an identity. Vietnam's story adds another dimension entirely because unlike Korea and Japan, which chose to engage with Chinese models from a position of relative independence, Vietnam was actually conquered and ruled by China for nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 111 BCE to 939 CE. This direct colonial experience makes Vietnam's relationship with Chinese culture complicated in a way that Korea's and Japan's simply isn't. Under Chinese rule, Vietnamese elites absorbed Confucian governance, Chinese agricultural techniques, and administrative structures, but Vietnamese society also developed a fierce tradition of resistance. When Vietnam finally regained independence in the 10th century, it faced a genuine question of identity. How do you build your own state after centuries of foreign rule? The Vietnamese answer was pragmatic. They retained Chinese-style administrative structures and Confucian bureaucracy because those tools were effective for governing, but they fiercely preserved Vietnamese language, local customs, and a distinct cultural identity. Think of it as using the colonizer's tools to build your own house. A key exam point, even after independence, Vietnam continued to model its political structures on China, adopting examination systems, Confucian court rituals, and tributary relationships, while simultaneously resisting Chinese domination militarily and culturally. This is not a contradiction. It's a sophisticated political strategy. Connecting to the broader AP framework. For your FRQ responses, the magic phrase you want to deploy is selective adoption of Chinese models. The College Board rewards students who can explain why each society adopted what it did. Geography mattered, existing power structures mattered, and the timing of contact mattered. This topic connects directly to Unit 1's broader theme of how states develop and legitimize power, and it echoes forward into Unit 3 and Unit 4 when you examine how contact and exchange transform societies. The very same dynamic, borrowing selectively while maintaining local identity, reappears when you study the Islamic world's adoption of Greek philosophy or the way Mesoamerican civilizations transmitted cultural practices across regions. One final MCQ trap to watch. Don't assume that more Chinese influence meant less political autonomy. Vietnam was deeply influenced by China and fiercely independent. Japan borrowed extensively and developed a uniquely non-Chinese political system. Influence and autonomy are not opposites on this exam. They're two variables that move independently. With that framework in mind, selective adoption, local adaptation, and maintained distinctiveness, you're ready to think about how the societies of South and Southeast Asia were navigating their own complex relationships with powerful neighboring civilizations. 1.2 Developments in Dar al-Islam from c. 1200 to c. 1450. What is Dar al-Islam and why does it matter? Let's start with the term itself, because the College Board uses it deliberately and you need to be precise. Dar al-Islam literally means the House of Islam in Arabic, and it refers not to a single empire or government, but to the vast interconnected world of Muslim-majority societies that stretched from West Africa to Southeast Asia during this period. Think of it less like a country and more like a civilization, the way we might talk about the Western world today without meaning one specific nation. That distinction is huge on the AP exam. If an MCQ asks you what unified Dar al-Islam, the answer is shared religion, law, trade networks, and intellectual traditions, not a single political authority. Don't fall into the trap of treating it like a unified empire. By 1200, Dar al-Islam had already been a dominant force for centuries, but the period from 1200 to 1450 is defined by two massive disruptions and the remarkable ways Islamic civilization not only survived them, but adapted, expanded, and in some ways flourished. Those two disruptions are the Mongol invasions and the Crusades. Keep both of them in your mental toolkit as you work through this section. The Mongol invasions and the destruction of Baghdad. In 1258, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad and executed the last Abbasid caliph. Let that sink in for a moment. The Abbasid Caliphate had been the symbolic heart of Sunni Islam for over 5 centuries. Imagine someone walking into the Vatican and ending the papacy overnight. The destruction was genuinely catastrophic. The House of Wisdom, one of the great libraries of the medieval world, was reportedly destroyed, and the irrigation systems that made Mesopotamia productive were severely damaged, effects that lingered for generations. But here is the counterintuitive twist that the AP exam loves to test. The Mongols didn't destroy Islam. In fact, within a generation or two, the Mongol rulers of Persia and Central Asia, the Ilkhanate, converted to Islam. This is a perfect example of a pattern you'll see repeatedly in AP world history. Conquerors often absorb the culture of the conquered. The Mongols were militarily dominant, but Islamic civilization was culturally and intellectually dominant. The Ilkhanate's conversion meant that Mongol rulers eventually became patrons of Persian Islamic art, architecture, and scholarship. Islamic culture bent like a reed in a storm and then grew back stronger. This connects directly to Unit 3, where you'll examine how the Mongol Empire facilitated trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica, that period of relative stability across the Silk Roads, actually helped Islamic merchants, scholars, and missionaries travel more freely between regions. So the same force that seemed to threaten Dar al-Islam also helped spread it. Political fragmentation and the rise of new Islamic states. The collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate accelerated political fragmentation, but this is another trap area. Political fragmentation did not mean cultural or religious decline. Without a single caliphate holding symbolic authority, new regional powers stepped into the vacuum. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt became enormously significant. They stopped the Mongol advance at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the first major defeat of a Mongol army in the field. The College Board expects you to know this battle as evidence that the Mongols were not unstoppable, and that the Mamluks served as defenders of Sunni Islamic civilization during a moment of crisis. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the Ottoman state was beginning its slow rise. Although the Great Ottoman expansion belongs more fully to the post-1450 period, you should understand its roots here. The Ottomans emerged from one of many small Turkic principalities in the borderlands between the Byzantine Empire and the former Mongol territories, a frontier zone where Islam spread through a combination of conquest, intermarriage, and the missionary activity of Sufi orders. The role of Sufism in spreading Islam. Sufism deserves its own moment in your review because it appears repeatedly in AP exam questions about Islamic expansion. Sufi orders, brotherhoods of mystics focused on personal spiritual experience and closeness to God, were extraordinarily effective missionaries, not because they traveled with armies, but because they traveled with merchants. Sufis adapted their message to local cultures, incorporated existing spiritual practices, and built communities around shrines and teachers. This is how Islam spread so effectively into sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia during this period, not primarily through conquest, but through commerce and conversion. When you see a question about why Islam spread peacefully in certain regions, Sufism and trade networks are almost always part of the correct answer. Intellectual and cultural continuity, even amid political disruption, Islamic scholars preserved and extended classical knowledge. The tradition of translating, commenting on, and synthesizing Greek, Persian, and Indian learning continued. Scholars like Ibn Battuta and Ibn Khaldun, both active in the 14th century, exemplify this intellectual vitality. Ibn Battuta's Rihla is a remarkable travel account covering roughly 75,000 miles across Dar al-Islam, and it demonstrates just how interconnected Muslim societies were by this period. Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah introduced sophisticated ideas about social cohesion, asabiya, and the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations, ideas that historians still reference today. Both figures show up in AP exam stimulus materials, so recognize their names and what they represent. the cosmopolitanism and scholarly tradition of Dar al-Islam even in turbulent times. Connecting to trade and the global tapestry. Don't lose sight of the broader Unit 1 framework. Dar al-Islam was not isolated. It sat at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean trade network, the Silk Roads, and the Trans-Saharan trade routes. Islamic merchants, the dhow sailing routes of the Indian Ocean, and the caravanserais of Central Asia were the circulatory system of medieval global commerce. When you connect this section to topics like Mali, the Indian Ocean network, or Song Dynasty China, you're building exactly the kind of cross-regional synthesis the AP exam rewards in long essay and document-based questions. As you move forward into the next section, you'll see how these same trade networks and patterns of cultural exchange shaped the societies of sub-Saharan Africa, where Dar al-Islam's reach was profoundly felt, especially through the Mali Empire and the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa. 1.2a Abbasid Caliphate Decline and the Fragmentation of Islamic Political Authority. The rise before the fall. Let's start by setting the scene, because context is everything on the AP exam. The Abbasid Caliphate, which rose to power in 750 CE by overthrowing the Umayyads, was at one point the most sophisticated and powerful political entity in the world. Think of it like the Roman Empire at its height, vast, cosmopolitan, and seemingly indestructible. Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, founded in 762 CE, was the intellectual and commercial heart of the medieval world. We're talking about a city of perhaps 1 million people when London had maybe 20,000. The Abbasid court sponsored translation movements, housed the famous House of Wisdom, and connected trade networks stretching from Spain to Southeast Asia. So when you ask yourself, how does something this powerful fall apart? That's exactly the right question, and it's the question the AP exam wants you to be able to answer with precision. The mechanics of decline. Here's an analogy that might stick with you. Imagine a franchise restaurant that gets so big, so fast, that the headquarters can no longer control what every location is doing. Local managers start making their own rules, sourcing their own ingredients, and eventually some of them just stop sending profits back to corporate entirely. That's essentially what happened to the Abbasids. The caliphate was simply too large to govern from the center. As the 9th and 10th centuries unfolded, provincial governors, many of them military commanders of Turkic origin, began accumulating independent power. These commanders, often called emirs, controlled armies that the caliphs increasingly depended on. And when you depend on someone else's army, you've already lost a significant portion of your actual authority. The College Board specifically wants you to understand this concept of political fragmentation, which means the breakdown of a unified political structure into smaller competing regional powers. This is not the same as cultural fragmentation, and that distinction matters enormously for the exam. Islamic culture, trade networks, and religious practice actually remained remarkably cohesive, even as political authority shattered. A merchant traveling from Cairo to Samarkand in the year 1000 CE would have found shared language, shared law, shared faith, and shared commercial practices, even though he would have crossed multiple independent political entities. Don't let an MCQ trick you into thinking that political fragmentation equals cultural collapse. It absolutely does not. The Buyid takeover and the puppet caliph problem. The most dramatic symbol of Abbasid weakness came in 945 CE when the Buyids, a Shia dynasty from Persia, actually marched into Baghdad and took physical control of the government. The Abbasid caliph was kept alive, even treated with ceremonial respect, but he had no real power whatsoever. Think of it like a constitutional monarchy where the monarch becomes purely decorative. Except in this case, the monarch didn't even choose to become decorative. He was forced into it. The Buyids kept the caliph around because his title still carried enormous religious legitimacy. This is a crucial concept. Even a powerless Abbasid caliph represented symbolic continuity with the Prophet Muhammad's community, and that symbol had political value to anyone who wanted their rule to appear legitimate. This is the kind of nuance that separates a score of 3 from a score of 5 on the FRQ. When the exam asks you to explain the significance of the caliphate's survival, even after losing political power, Your answer needs to invoke the concept of religious legitimacy, the idea that rulers across the fragmented Islamic world still sought the caliph's blessing precisely because it connected them to something larger than regional politics. Regional successor states, and what to know about each. As you study this topic, the AP exam expects you to recognize several key successor states that emerged from Abbasid fragmentation. The Fatimid Caliphate, established in 909 CE in North Africa and eventually controlling Egypt, was not just a rival political power, but a rival religious claim. The Fatimids were Ismaili Shia Muslims who established their own parallel caliphate in Cairo. This is a classic exam trap. Students often assume there was only one caliph at a time, but by the 10th century there were actually 3 simultaneously: the Abbasids in Baghdad, the Fatimids in Cairo, and the Umayyad remnant in Córdoba, Spain. If you see an MCQ question about the nature of Islamic political unity in the 10th century, fragmented and contested, is your answer not unified under Baghdad? The Seljuk Turks are another group you absolutely cannot ignore. When they swept into Baghdad in 1055 CE, they actually displaced the Buyids and became the new power behind the throne. The Seljuks were Sunni Muslims, which made them theoretically more compatible with the Abbasid Caliphate, and they used the title Sultan, a secular political title, while leaving the Caliph his religious role. This division between religious authority and political authority is a model that echoes across Islamic history, and is exactly the kind of conceptual pattern the AP exam rewards you for identifying. Connections to other units and the big picture. Here is where this topic pays dividends across the entire course. The political fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate directly enables several developments you'll encounter in later units. The vulnerability created by fragmentation made the Middle East susceptible to the Crusades beginning in 1095 CE. A fractured political landscape simply cannot mount a unified defense. More dramatically, it set the stage for the Mongol invasion of 1258 CE, when Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad, killed the last Abbasid caliph, and destroyed the House of Wisdom. That moment, which you'll revisit in Unit 2, is partly a story about what happens when fragmentation reaches its logical endpoint. Connect this also to Unit 1's broader theme of how different civilizations maintained cohesion or fell apart. The Abbasid case is your primary example of a major civilization maintaining cultural unity while experiencing political collapse, and that contrast will help you on comparative questions involving Song China or the Byzantine Empire. The most common exam mistakes. Before moving on, let me flag 3 traps students fall into repeatedly. First, do not conflate the end of Abbasid political dominance with the end of Islamic civilization. The culture flourished even as the caliphate weakened. Second, don't assume fragmentation was purely a weakness. Regional rulers sometimes drove local innovation and prosperity. Third, remember that the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 CE is the formal end of the Abbasid Caliphate, not the Buyid takeover or the Seljuk conquest, both of which left the caliphate technically intact. With the fractures in Islamic political authority clearly mapped in your mind, you're perfectly positioned to understand how those same trade networks and cultural exchange systems continued operating across political borders, which is exactly where we're headed next. 1.2b Mongol invasions and the sack of Baghdad 1258, the Ilkhanate. The storm from the steppe. Picture the most powerful city in the medieval world. Baghdad in the mid-13th century was the intellectual and cultural capital of the Islamic world, a city of libraries, hospitals, observatories, and perhaps 1 million inhabitants. The Abbasid Caliphate had ruled from here for 5 centuries. Scholars translated Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, and Indian mathematics under its rooftops. Now imagine that city reduced to rubble in a matter of days. That is the sack of Baghdad in 1258, and it is one of the most consequential events on your entire AP World History exam. To understand how it happened, you need to back up a generation. Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes of the Central Asian steppe around 1206 and launched a series of conquests that would eventually produce the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Think of the Mongols as a military operating system that could be installed anywhere. They absorbed conquered people's technologies, administrators, and artisans, then weaponized them against the next target. Genghis Khan himself died in 1227, but his sons and grandsons carried the project forward. The empire was then divided among his heirs into successor states called khanates, which is a word the College Board expects you to know and use precisely. Hulagu Khan and the Campaign West. The westward thrust into the Islamic heartland was led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis. He commanded the Mongol armies that swept through Persia and into Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, in the 1250s. When Hulagu demanded the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim submit and dismantle Baghdad's defenses, the caliph refused, reportedly believing divine protection would save the city. It did not. In February of 1258, the Mongols breached the walls, and what followed was catastrophic. Contemporary sources always take them with some nuance, since medieval chroniclers love dramatic exaggeration, describe hundreds of thousands killed and the famous House of Wisdom, a legendary library and scholarly institution, destroyed. Books were allegedly thrown into the Tigris River until the water ran black with ink. Whether or not every detail is literal, the symbolic and actual destruction was staggering. The Abbasid Caliph was executed, ending 5 centuries of Abbasid rule. This is the moment the College Board marks as a civilizational rupture, and you should treat it that way on the exam. Here is a trap you must avoid on the multiple choice section. Students often assume the Mongol conquests were purely destructive and left nothing behind. That is half the picture, and a half picture will cost you points. The Mongols were extraordinarily destructive during conquest, but after conquest they often facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and relative stability, a phenomenon historians call the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. The AP exam will test whether you can hold both ideas simultaneously. The Il Khanate, a state born from conquest. After the sack of Baghdad, Hulagu established the Il Khanate, one of the 4 major successor khanates of the Mongol Empire. The term Il Khan roughly means subordinate or regional Khan, acknowledging nominal authority under the Great Khan. The Il Khanate controlled Persia, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia, with its capital eventually at Tabriz in northwestern Persia. This is your geographic anchor, know it. The Il Khanate matters for 3 big reasons on the exam. First, it demonstrates how the Mongols governed conquered peoples. The Il Khans initially kept their traditional Mongolian shamanist or Buddhist religious practices while ruling a predominantly Muslim population. This created a fascinating political tension. Over time, however, and this is a critical turning point, the Il Khan Ghazan converted to Islam in 1295. This illustrates a pattern you will see repeatedly in AP World History. Conquerors eventually adopt elements of the cultures they conquer. Think of it like moving into someone else's house. Eventually, you start living by their rules. Ghazan's conversion also deepened the cultural synthesis between Mongol administrative structures and Persian Islamic traditions. Second, the Il Khanate is a prime example of the Mongol role in cross-cultural exchange. The Silk Roads, those overland and maritime trade networks connecting East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, functioned under Mongol protection. Merchants, diplomats, and missionaries moved more freely across Eurasia than at almost any prior moment in history. This connects directly to Unit 2 of the course, which covers networks of exchange. When you write a long essay or document-based question about trade networks, the Il Khanate is concrete evidence you can deploy to show how political structures enabled or disrupted commerce. Third, the Il Khanate's collapse and the 133s accelerated by the Black Death, which swept through Mongol trade networks and hit the Middle East devastatingly, connects to another major AP theme: how disease travels along trade routes and reshapes political power. The same roads that carried silk and spices also carried the plague. What the exam actually tests. The College Board wants you to analyze the Mongol conquests through the lens of its historical thinking skills, especially continuity and change over time and causation. For an FRQ, a high-scoring response would acknowledge that the Mongol invasions caused massive demographic and cultural disruption in Southwest Asia, while simultaneously enabling new patterns of cross-cultural exchange. Avoid one-dimensional answers. The rubric rewards complexity. A common wrong answer on multiple choice questions presents the sack of Baghdad as the end of Islamic civilization. Reject that framing immediately. The Islamic world experienced enormous recovery. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt stopped the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a date worth knowing, and centers of Islamic learning shifted and eventually recovered. Destruction was real, but so was resilience and continuity. Also watch for questions that conflate the different Khanate. The Khanate is in Persia and the Middle East. The Golden Horde is in Russia and the Western Steppe. The Chagatai Khanate is in Central Asia. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, is in China. Mixing these up on the exam is a very common error, and it will mislead you on questions about regional impact. Connecting the dots. When you encounter the Mongols anywhere on your exam, your mental checklist should run through destruction, then governance, then cultural synthesis, then trade facilitation, then eventual assimilation, because that arc plays out across nearly every Khanate. The Khanate is the clearest example of this full cycle in the Islamic world. With the Khanate in mind, you're well positioned to explore how those same Mongol-protected trade routes connected the hemispheres in ways that reshaped economies, religions, and populations, which is exactly where we're headed next, as we look at the broader networks of exchange in Unit 2. 1.2c. The Mamluk Sultanate and the Delhi Sultanate as examples of post-Abbasid Islamic states. The world after the Abbasids, a power vacuum filled, imagine the Roman Empire collapsing overnight. Cities that once hummed with bureaucrats, scholars, and merchants suddenly find themselves asking, who's in charge now? That's essentially what happened to the Islamic world in the 13th century. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had been the symbolic and political heart of Sunni Islam for 5 centuries, was shattered in 1258 when Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad and executed the last caliph. This is your anchor date, 1258, and the AP exam loves to test whether you understand what it represents. Not just the fall of one dynasty, but the fracturing of a unified Islamic political order into a constellation of regional successor states. This is the critical framing for everything in Section 1.2c. The College Board wants you to understand the Mamluk Sultanate and the Delhi Sultanate not as isolated kingdoms, but as examples of how Islamic political and cultural traditions survived and adapted after the Abbasid center collapsed. Think of them as franchise locations that kept operating after corporate headquarters burned down. The brand Islamic governance, law, culture, and faith continued. The central authority did not. The Mamluk Sultanate, soldiers who became kings. Let's start in Egypt with one of history's most fascinating political stories. The word Mamluk comes from an Arabic root meaning owned or slave, and that tells you almost everything. The Mamluks were enslaved soldiers, mostly of Turkic and later Circassian origin, who were purchased as boys, given elite military training, converted to Islam, and incorporated into the armies of the Ayyubid sultans of Egypt. Here's the twist that trips up so many students. Being a Mamluk was actually a path to tremendous power and prestige. This was not a system of degradation in the way modern listeners might imagine. Mamluks were highly valued precisely because, as outsiders with no tribal allegiances, they were theoretically loyal only to whoever owned them. They were the professional corps of the army, the Navy SEALs of medieval Egypt, if you will. In 1250, the Mamluks did what soldiers with all the guns eventually do. They took over. They assassinated the last Ayyubid sultan and established their own sultanate, ruling Egypt and Syria for nearly 3 centuries, until 1517. Now here's where it gets AP exam significant. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, the Mamluk forces under Sultan Qutuz defeated the Mongols, the first major Mongol defeat in the field. You need to know this battle by name. It's a turning point that the College Board frequently uses in document-based questions and multiple choice because it demonstrates that Islamic civilization had a military force capable of halting the Mongol tide. The Mamluks effectively became the shield of the Arab world. The Mamluks also did something politically brilliant. They invited a member of the Abbasid family who had escaped the Mongol sack to Cairo, installed him as a ceremonial caliph, and essentially used him as a legitimizing rubber stamp. This gave the Mamluk sultans, who were technically slaves turned generals with no royal bloodline, a veneer of Islamic legitimacy. Watch for this on the exam. The relationship between the Mamluks and this shadow caliphate is a perfect illustration of how post-Abbasid rulers managed the tension between military power and religious authority. Power lived in the sultan's palace. Legitimacy lived in the mosque. The Delhi Sultanate, Islam moves east. While the Mamluks were reshaping the Western Islamic world, a parallel story was unfolding on the Indian subcontinent. The Delhi Sultanate, established in 1206, represents the consolidation of Islamic political power in South Asia, a region that was majority Hindu and Buddhist. Understanding this context is crucial. The Delhi sultans were not governing a population that shared their religion. They were a Muslim ruling minority presiding over a vast, religiously diverse society. This creates dynamics the AP exam tests repeatedly. Questions about how Islamic rulers managed non-Muslim subjects, how they adapted to local conditions, and what role conversion played. The Delhi Sultanate was founded by Qutb-ud-Din Aibak, himself a former Mamluk general, notice that word again, who had served under the Ghurid rulers of Afghanistan. This connection is worth remembering because it shows you how the Mamluk institution extended far beyond Egypt. The sultans of Delhi built mosques alongside Hindu temples, patronized Persian literature and art, and administered a vast territory using a mix of Islamic law and local administrative traditions. The Qutb Minar in Delhi, a soaring minaret begun under Aibak, still stands today and serves as a physical reminder of how Islamic architectural traditions were transplanted into a new cultural environment. One of the most AP exam important things to understand about the Delhi Sultanate is its relationship to the Mongol threat. While the Mamluks stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut in the west, the Delhi sultans faced repeated Mongol invasions from Central Asia coming through Afghanistan. Several Delhi sultans, particularly Alauddin Khalji in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, repelled these invasions successfully, making Delhi a second major center of Islamic resistance to Mongol expansion. This parallel structure, with the Mamluks holding the western front and Delhi holding the eastern front, is a powerful conceptual framework for your essays. Common traps and connections to watch for. The most common MCQ trap here is confusing the founding dates or conflating the two sultanates. Keep them straight. Mamluks in Egypt from 1250 to 1517. Delhi Sultanate in India from 1206 to 1526. Another trap is assuming these states were culturally isolated. Both sultanates were vibrant centers of Persian-influenced Islamic culture, patronizing art, architecture, and scholarship, even as they maintained military governments. The College Board also loves to ask about the role of religion in governance. Remember that neither sultanate was a theocracy. Sultans held political power. Religious scholars called ulama held interpretive authority over Islamic law. That tension between sultan and ulama is a thread that runs through all of Unit 1 and reappears in Unit 3 when you encounter the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. Speaking of which, notice that the Delhi Sultanate is eventually replaced by the Mughal Empire in 1526, and the Mamluks are conquered by the Ottomans in 1517. Both successor empires are major Unit 3 topics, so the timeline flows naturally. Understanding the Mamluks and Delhi now will make the Gunpowder Empires feel like a logical continuation rather than a fresh start. With this picture of fractured but resilient Islamic civilization in your mind, you're perfectly set up to explore the other post-Mongol world. Because next, we'll be turning to the societies of East Asia and how China under Mongol rule both absorbed and transformed its conquerors. 1.2D Sufism and the spread of Islam. The role of ulama and religious scholars. Let's talk about two of the most powerful forces behind Islam's remarkable spread across the medieval world, Sufism and the religious scholarly class known as the ulama. If you've ever wondered how a religion born in the Arabian Peninsula managed to reach West Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent within just a few centuries, these two forces are a huge part of the answer. Think of them as the two engines on the same airplane. one powered by the heart, the other by the mind. Sufism, the heart of Islamic expansion. Sufism is the mystical tradition within Islam. Sufis sought a direct, personal experience of the divine, a deeply felt emotional connection to God that went beyond just following rules and rituals. Imagine the difference between reading a recipe for a meal and actually sitting down and tasting the food. Orthodox Islamic practice, for many Sufis, felt like reading the recipe. They wanted to taste God directly. Sufi practitioners organized themselves into brotherhoods called tariqa, plural, turuk, which you can think of as spiritual guilds or fraternities. These orders had a master, called a sheikh or pir, who guided disciples along a path of spiritual development. The practices associated with Sufism, including music, poetry, ecstatic dance, as with the famous whirling dervishes of the Mevlevi order, and the veneration of saints at their shrines, made Islam emotionally accessible in a way that formal theology sometimes struggled to do. Here's where this becomes critical for your AP exam. Sufis were extraordinarily effective missionaries precisely because of this adaptability. When a Sufi missionary arrived in a new region, say the Bengal Delta in South Asia or the trading cities of sub-Saharan West Africa, they didn't lead with abstract legal debates. They built relationships, performed acts of charity, demonstrated piety through personal example, and often incorporated local customs and traditions into their spiritual practice. This is the concept of syncretism, and the College Board loves testing it. Sufism spread Islam through accommodation and personal connection, not conquest. You need to be able to distinguish this from the political or military spread of Islam, which is a separate mechanism entirely. Sufi shrines, called dargahs, became pilgrimage destinations and community centers. Even after a Sufi missionary died, their tomb became a sacred site that drew local populations into the broader Islamic world. This is a perfect example of how cultural diffusion works through networks of people, not just armies or trade caravans, though those mattered too. The ulama, the mind of the Islamic world. Now let's flip to the other engine. The ulama, singular, alim, were the learned scholars of Islamic law and theology. The word literally means those who have knowledge, and they were the guardians of the Sharia, Islamic law derived from the Quran and the Hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Think of the ulama as a combination of lawyers, judges, theologians, and university professors, all rolled into one social class. Their role in maintaining Islamic civilization cannot be overstated. In the absence of a formal clergy in Sunni Islam, unlike, say, the Catholic Church with its pope and bishops, the ulama provided the institutional backbone that held Islamic societies together across vast distances and diverse cultures. They staffed the madrasas, the Islamic schools and universities that trained the next generation of scholars. They served as judges in qadi courts. They issued fatwas, legal opinions on matters of religious practice and law. They were the intellectual infrastructure of the Islamic world. For the AP exam, you need to understand that the ulama represented a form of cultural continuity. Rulers came and went. The Abbasid Caliphate eventually fell to the Mongols in 1258, but the ulama persisted. They were the thread that connected Islamic communities from Morocco to Malacca. This is why the College Board pairs them with topics like the Abbasid Caliphate, 1.2a, and with the later Mongol period, Unit 2, where you'll see that even Mongol rulers in Persia eventually converted to Islam, partly because the ulama provided administrative expertise and legitimacy. Common exam traps and distinctions you must know. Here's a trap that appears repeatedly on AP multiple-choice questions. Students often confuse the spread of Islam through Sufism with the spread of Islam through Arab conquest. The exam will give you a passage about a merchant or a Sufi mystic facilitating conversion and ask you to identify the mechanism of spread. If the source emphasizes personal relationships, spiritual charisma, trade networks, or syncretic practices, the answer is almost certainly cultural diffusion through Sufism or commerce, not military conquest. Conquest explains the political expansion of early Islamic empires. It does not fully explain why local populations in Bengal or the Swahili coast adopted Islam as their own faith over generations. Another common confusion is between the ulama and the caliphs. The caliph was the political and, in theory, religious leader of the Islamic community. The ulama were not rulers, they were scholars who derived their authority from knowledge of religious law, not from political power. In practice, there was often tension between the two. Rulers needed the ulama's legitimacy to govern. The ulama needed rulers' protection and patronage. This tension appears in FRQ prompts about political versus religious authority and connects directly to continuity and change over time. Arguments you might need to make. Also, be precise with your vocabulary. On an FRQ, writing Islamic scholars when you mean ulama will not earn you the same credit as using the AP-specific term. College Board rubrics reward precise terminology. Connections across the course. You'll see these themes echo throughout the entire AP World History modern curriculum. In Unit 2, the Mongol conquests initially devastated Islamic institutions, but the ulama's resilience helped Islam survive and even expand further. In Unit 3, you'll encounter the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, all of which engaged deeply with both the ulama and Sufi orders, sometimes in tension with each other. In Unit 4, as European colonial powers expanded, Sufi networks in Africa and South Asia often became centers of resistance. The patterns you're learning here are not isolated facts. They are recurring structures of how religion, scholarship, and spiritual community shape civilizations across centuries. The story of Sufism and the ulama is ultimately a story about how ideas travel through the hearts of mystics and the minds of scholars, and that story is far from over as we move deeper into the medieval world. 1.2e Islamic Scholarship, Translation Movements and Intellectual Life, House of Wisdom Legacy. Setting the stage. Why this matters. Imagine you're a student in 9th century Baghdad, and your city is quite literally the intellectual capital of the world. The streets smell like cardamom and ink. Scholars from Persia, Greece, India, and the Arab world are crowded into the same building, arguing over mathematics and medicine and the nature of the stars. That building is the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, and understanding what happened there is absolutely essential for your AP exam. This isn't just ancient history trivia. The College Board uses Islamic scholarship as a case study in how knowledge moves across cultures, how networks transmit ideas, and how civilizations build on each other. Let's break all of this down. The House of Wisdom, what it actually was. The House of Wisdom was founded in Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate, reaching its peak under Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century CE. You need to know that the Abbasid Caliphate, 750–1258 CE, is your key political context here. The Abbasids moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, and that geographic shift matters. Baghdad sat at the crossroads of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to Persia, Central Asia, and India. Think of it like moving your headquarters from a regional airport to the world's busiest hub. Ideas, like goods, flowed through it constantly. The House of Wisdom was a translation bureau, library, and research academy, all rolled into one. Scholars were paid enormous salaries. Reportedly, the weight of translated books in gold, though, that's likely an embellishment, to bring Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac texts into Arabic. This is what the College Board calls a translation movement, and you need to understand it as a deliberate state-sponsored enterprise, not an accidental process. Al-Ma'mun wasn't just a bookworm. He understood that knowledge was power, and he funded intellectual life the way a modern government might fund space exploration. The translation movement, process, and significance. Here's the analogy that makes this stick. Think of the translation movement like an ancient version of the Internet's ability to aggregate and redistribute information. Works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, Galen, and others that had been sitting largely unused in Byzantine libraries were translated first into Syriac, an intermediate step, often done by Christian scholars, then into Arabic. Indian scholars contributed the decimal numeral system and early algebraic concepts through texts like the Brahmasputra Siddhanta. Persian, administrative and philosophical traditions flowed in through Zoroastrian and Sassanid sources. The critical AP exam point here is that this was not passive preservation. Islamic scholars didn't just photocopy old books, they synthesized, corrected, and extended the knowledge they received. Al-Khwarizmi didn't just translate Indian mathematics, he developed what we now call algebra. The word itself comes from the Arabic al-jabr, from the title of his treatise. His name is the root of the word algorithm. When you use GPS, you're downstream of a 9th century Baghdad scholar. That's the kind of connection that helps you remember why this matters. Key, scholars, and fields you must know. For the AP exam, you need specific names tied to specific contributions. Al-Khwarizmi gave us algebra and the decimal numeral system's integration into Islamic and eventually European scholarship. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, which remained a standard medical textbook in Europe into the 17th century. That's nearly 800 years of influence, which is a staggering measure of intellectual reach. Ibn al-Haytham pioneered optics and the scientific method. His work on how light enters the eye overturned Greek assumptions held for centuries. Al-Biruni conducted fieldwork in India and wrote about comparative cultures with a rigor that looks almost modern. Al-Idrisi produced some of the most accurate world maps of the medieval period, used by European monarchs like Roger II of Sicily. Notice the diversity here. These scholars weren't all Arab, weren't all from the same religious background, and weren't all located in Baghdad. The Islamic world, by the 9th through 13th centuries, stretched from Spain, Al-Andalus, to Central Asia, and intellectual life thrived in Cordoba, Cairo, Samarkand, and beyond. The AP exam may present you with a source from Islamic Spain or Persia and expect you to recognize it as part of this same broader tradition. Common MCQ traps and how to avoid them. The most dangerous wrong answer trap on this topic is the framing that Islamic scholars were merely preserving classical knowledge until Europeans were ready to pick it up again. This is a Eurocentric distortion that the College Board explicitly wants you to push back on. If a question implies that the significance of Islamic scholarship is primarily about keeping Greek texts safe, that answer is almost certainly wrong. The correct framing emphasizes synthesis, innovation, and original contribution. A second trap involves timeline confusion. Students sometimes misplace the House of Wisdom, don't confuse it with the earlier Umayyad Caliphate, or assume it fell with the early Abbasid period. The Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 CE, which destroyed the House of Wisdom, is a meaningful endpoint you should know. The legend says that the Tigris River ran black with ink from all the books thrown into it, a powerful image for remembering the date. A third trap is scope creep. Students sometimes write about Islamic scholarship in ways that accidentally imply all intellectual life was exclusively centered in Baghdad. Remember that Al-Andalus, Muslim Iberia, and Cairo's Al-Azhar University were also major centers. The College Board rewards geographic specificity. Connections across units. This topic is a bridge that connects to almost every unit in the course. In Unit 2, the Mongol Empire disrupts the very networks that made the House of Wisdom possible, while also creating new Silk Road connections that carry Islamic intellectual traditions eastward. In Unit 3, the Renaissance in Europe is partly explained by the recovery of classical and Islamic texts through contact in Spain and Sicily. You can't understand Leonardo da Vinci without tracing the path back through Islamic intermediaries. The broader pattern networks, enabling the diffusion of ideas, religions, and technologies, is the spine of the entire AP World History modern curriculum, and the House of Wisdom is one of the clearest examples of that pattern you'll encounter. For FRQ responses, whenever you're asked to explain how cultures interact, or how knowledge spreads, the Islamic translation movement is a high-value example precisely because it demonstrates state sponsorship of intellectual exchange, multicultural collaboration, and the transformation rather than mere transmission of ideas. Graders love specificity. Drop Ibn Sina, Al-Khwarizmi, or Al-Idrisi by name with a concrete contribution, and you're earning those points. With a rich picture of Islamic intellectual life in mind, we're ready to zoom out and examine how these networks of knowledge connected to the broader trade routes and cross-cultural exchanges that shaped the entire Afro-Eurasian world. 1.3. Developments in South and Southeast Asia from c. 1 to 100 to c. 1450. The big picture. Why this region matters. Alright, let's talk about a part of the world that students often underestimate on the AP exam, South and Southeast Asia during one of the most dynamic centuries in human history. Picture this region like a busy intersection. You've got goods, ideas, religions, and armies all converging at once. The Delhi Sultanate is reshaping northern India. Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms are constructing monuments that still awe visitors today. And maritime trade routes are threading through the islands and coastlines of Southeast Asia like veins through a leaf. Understanding this intersection is not optional if you're aiming for a 5. It appears in multiple-choice questions, document-based questions, and long essay prompts, often as a comparison or continuity and change over time scenario. The Delhi Sultanate. Islam arrives in South Asia. Let's start in northern India, where one of the exam's most frequently tested developments takes place. In 1206, a series of Turkic Muslim rulers established what we call the Delhi Sultanate, which would govern much of northern India all the way through 1556. Think of the Delhi Sultanate as a new management team taking over a very old, very established company. The company, Indian civilization, had been running for millennia under Hindu and Buddhist traditions. The new management spoke a different language, prayed differently, and organized power differently. The result was not simply replacement of one culture by another, but a complicated, creative, and sometimes violent process of blending and resistance. Here's what the AP exam wants you to know cold. The Delhi Sultanate represents the arrival and consolidation of Islamic political power in South Asia. The sultans were Muslim rulers governing a predominantly Hindu population. They generally allowed Hindus to practice their religion, classifying them under Islamic law as people of the book in a loose sense. But they also imposed a tax on non-Muslims called the jizya, imposed restrictions on Hindu temple construction in some periods, and drew their administrative class heavily from Muslim elites. This created a layered society, and that layering produced cultural synthesis. Persian became the language of the court and high culture. New architectural styles blended Islamic geometric design with Indian decorative traditions, and Sufi mystics, wandering Islamic teachers who emphasized personal devotion and spiritual experience over rigid legalism, became enormously influential in spreading Islam among ordinary Indians, in ways that formal conquest never could have achieved alone. That last point about Sufis is a classic MCQ favorite. If you see a question asking how Islam spread within South Asia, the answer is not primarily military conquest. It's Sufi missionaries and trade networks. Don't confuse how Islam arrived in power with how it spread in practice. Those are two different stories. Continuity in Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms. Now here's a trap. Students fall into all the time. They assume that because the Delhi Sultanate is politically dominant in the north, all of South and Southeast Asia was somehow transformed. Absolutely not. Hinduism remained the dominant religious and cultural framework across much of the subcontinent and throughout Southeast Asia. In southern India, powerful Hindu kingdoms like the Vijayanagara Empire, established around 1336, just at the tail end of our period, actively resisted sultanate expansion and preserved classical Hindu traditions. The AP exam will test whether you understand that political change in one region does not equal cultural uniformity across an entire continent. Southeast Asia is where this continuity becomes especially vivid. The Khmer Empire, centered in what is today Cambodia, built Angkor Wat, one of the largest religious monuments ever constructed, in the 12th century as a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, later repurposed as a Buddhist site. If an exam question asks you to identify what Angkor Wat reveals about Khmer society, you should be thinking Indian cultural influence, specifically Indianization, the process by which South Asian religious, artistic, and political models spread throughout Southeast Asia through trade and diplomacy rather than conquest. Kingdoms like the Khmer adopted Sanskrit as a prestige language, modeled their rulers as semi-divine Hindu or Buddhist figures, and built their capitals to reflect cosmic Hindu geography. This is fundamentally different from the Islamization happening in northern India, and the AP exam loves to test that distinction. the role of trade tying it all together. You cannot talk about South and Southeast Asia in this period without talking about maritime trade, and this is where the topic connects powerfully to other units. The Indian Ocean Trade Network, which you'll see again in Unit 2 and referenced throughout the course, ran directly through this region. The Strait of Malacca, a narrow waterway between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, was the choke point of global commerce. Whoever controlled it influenced trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The maritime kingdom of Srivijaya, based in Sumatra, had dominated this strait for centuries, using naval power and commercial taxation by our period. Srivijaya was declining, and new powers like the Majapahit Empire of Java were rising to fill the vacuum. What's the AP takeaway? Trade drove religious and cultural exchange, just as much as conquest did. Muslim merchants sailing from the Persian Gulf in India brought Islam into port cities across Southeast Asia, long before any Islamic ruler held power there. This is your model for understanding how religions and ideas travel, not just through armies but through markets, marriages, and merchant communities settling in foreign ports. That's a recurring theme the AP exam will test across multiple units, from the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Roads to the spread of Islam through the Indian Ocean. Recognize the pattern and you'll be ready for it wherever it appears. Common confusions to clear up right now. 2 clarifications before we move on. First, don't confuse the Delhi Sultanate with the Mughal Empire. The Mughals come later, starting in 1526. That's Unit 3 territory. During our period of 1200 to 1450, it's the Sultanate. Second, don't assume Indianization of Southeast Asia means direct Indian political control. It does not. Southeast Asian rulers chose to adopt Indian cultural models because doing so enhanced their prestige and legitimacy. It was a voluntary, elite-driven process of cultural borrowing, not colonization. As you move into the next section on East Asia, keep in mind that the trade networks, cultural borrowing, and political fragmentation you've just seen in South and Southeast Asia are going to rhyme beautifully with patterns developing along the Silk Roads and in China, because in this era, no region was truly isolated from the rest. 1.3a. The Delhi Sultanate, Political Structure and the Spread of Islam in South Asia. Setting the stage, why the Delhi Sultanate matters. Let's start with a mental image. Picture the Indian subcontinent around the year 1200 CE, a sprawling, diverse region of competing Hindu kingdoms, thriving trade networks, and ancient religious traditions stretching back millennia. Now imagine a series of Central Asian warriors sweeping in from the northwest through the mountain passes of Afghanistan and establishing an entirely new political order right in the heart of northern India. That's exactly what happened. And what emerged from that collision of cultures was the Delhi Sultanate, one of the most consequential political entities in South Asian history. An absolutely essential material for your AP World History exam. The Delhi Sultanate lasted from roughly 1206 to 1526 CE, and it represents the first major sustained Islamic political presence in the South Asian subcontinent. Before you dive into the details, here's the big picture frame College Board wants you to carry through the entire unit. The Delhi Sultanate is a case study in how cross-cultural contact through conquest, trade, and migration transforms societies. Keep that lens on at all times. Political structure, how the Sultanate was organized. The Delhi Sultanate was not a unified monolithic empire the way students sometimes imagine it. Think of it less like a modern nation-state and more like a franchise arrangement, the Sultan at the center ruling from Delhi and regional governors, called iqtidars, controlling territories called iqtas in exchange for military service and tax revenues sent back to the center. If that sounds familiar, it should. This is a version of the same logic as European feudalism, except rooted in Islamic administrative tradition borrowed from the Abbasid Caliphate and Persian bureaucratic models. That connection to the Abbasid Caliphate is something College Board loves to test. The Delhi Sultanate was consciously drawing on existing Islamic governing frameworks rather than inventing everything from scratch. The Sultanate went through 5 successive dynasties: the Slave Dynasty, also called the Mamluk Dynasty, the Khilji Dynasty, the Tughlaq Dynasty, the Sayyid Dynasty, and the Lode Dynasty. You don't need to memorize every ruler, but you absolutely need to know that these dynasties represent periods of expansion, consolidation, and decline. The most significant rulers for exam purposes are Qutb-ud-Din Aybak, who founded the Sultanate, Iltutmish, who consolidated it, Alauddin Khalji, who expanded it to its greatest territorial extent and implemented aggressive market control policies, and Muhammad bin Tughlaq, famous for controversial administrative decisions like moving the capital to Daulatabad. That last one is a favorite MCQ detail. Examiners love asking why the capital was moved to better control the south, and why it failed. Logistical nightmare. Alienated northern elites caused chaos. One crucial structural point: the sultans ruled as Muslims over an overwhelmingly Hindu population. This created a persistent tension that shaped every aspect of governance. The sultans relied heavily on a class of administrators, many of them Persian-speaking Central Asian immigrants or converted locals, to run the bureaucracy. Persian became the language of the court and administration, not Arabic, and certainly not any local Indian language. This is a subtle but testable detail. Persian cultural influence in South Asia flows directly from the Delhi Sultanate. The spread of Islam. How and why? Now here's where students make their biggest mistake, and you need to avoid this trap on the exam. The AP exam does not want you to say that Islam spread in South Asia purely through forced conversion at the point of a sword. That is an oversimplification that will cost you points on FRQs. The reality, and what College Board expects, is that Islam spread through multiple overlapping pathways. First, there was the role of Sufi mystics. Sufism is a mystical, spiritual tradition within Islam that emphasized a personal, emotional connection with the divine. Think of it as the contemplative, devotional branch of Islam. Sufi missionaries, called pirs or sheikhs, traveled throughout South Asia and often found receptive audiences among lower caste Hindus and other groups who felt excluded from the rigid social hierarchy of Brahmanical Hinduism. The Sufis were culturally flexible. They sometimes incorporated local music, poetry, and customs into their practice, making Islam feel accessible rather than alien. This is syncretism in action, and it's a concept College Board returns to again and again across Unit 1. Second, trade networks facilitated conversion. Arab and Persian merchants had been trading along India's coasts for centuries before the Sultanate, and commercial relationships frequently brought religious exchange alongside goods. Port communities in coastal India had Muslim populations well before any Sultanate soldier arrived. Third, yes, political incentives mattered. Conversion could bring tax advantages. Non-Muslims under the Sultanate paid a tax called the jizya, a protection tax levied on non-Muslim subjects in an Islamic state. Conversion removed that financial burden, and for poorer communities, that was a meaningful incentive. Connecting to the broader AP framework, the Delhi Sultanate connects to several other key threads in the course. In terms of Unit 1 themes, it exemplifies the way state building in this period often involved incorporating diverse religious and ethnic groups while maintaining a dominant culture at court. When you compare it to the Mongol Empire, also in Unit 1, you see a parallel dynamic: conquerors who eventually adopted elements of the cultures they ruled. The Mongols converted to Islam partly under Central Asian influence. The Delhi Sultanate's rulers themselves were Central Asian Turks who adopted Persian culture. Layers upon layers of cultural exchange. Looking ahead to Unit 3, the Delhi Sultanate sets the stage for the Mughal Empire 1526 to 1857, which absorbed and expanded upon everything the Sultanate built. When Babur defeated the last Lodi Sultan at the First Battle of Panipat in 1526, he wasn't erasing the Sultanate's legacy, he was inheriting it. The Mughal administrative system, the Persian court culture, the complex relationship between Muslim rulers and Hindu subjects, all of it flows directly from the 3 centuries of the Delhi Sultanate. Common exam traps to watch. Watch out for 2 traps specifically. First, don't confuse the Delhi Sultanate with the Mughal Empire. They are sequential, not simultaneous, and they have distinct founding dates, dynasties, and characteristics. Second, avoid the temptation to describe Hindu-Muslim relations in this period as purely hostile. The exam rewards nuance. There was real conflict, yes, but also genuine cultural synthesis, shared artistic traditions, and economic interdependence. When you encounter an FRQ asking you to explain how the Delhi Sultanate shaped South Asian society, hit three angles: political structure and its Persian Islamic roots, the multi-pathway spread of Islam including Sufi influence, and the resulting cultural synthesis that blended South Asian and Islamic traditions. That's your three-point framework for a high-scoring response. With the Delhi Sultanate firmly in view, we're now ready to zoom out and look at how other powerful states across Afro-Eurasia were simultaneously building their own complex political and cultural systems, and the surprising ways those worlds were already beginning to connect. 1.3b Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms in Southeast Asia, Khmer Empire, Majapahit, Srivijaya. Setting the scene. Why Southeast Asia matters? Picture a massive highway interchange, not one made of asphalt but of ocean currents and river valleys, where traders, monks, and diplomats have been passing through for thousands of years. That's Southeast Asia in the pre-modern world. Positioned between India to the west and China to the north and east, the region sat at the crossroads of everything. And here's the key insight you need to lock in before we go any further. The kingdoms we're about to discuss didn't simply receive Indian and Chinese cultural influences and copy them wholesale. They adapted those influences selectively and creatively, blending them with deeply rooted local traditions to produce something genuinely distinctive. The College Board calls this process Indianization, and understanding it precisely is the difference between a 3 and a 5 on this exam. What Indianization actually means: Indianization refers to the spread of Indian cultural, religious, and political ideas into Southeast Asia through trade networks, particularly those crossing the Indian Ocean. Merchants, Brahmin priests, and Buddhist monks traveling along maritime trade routes carried Sanskrit texts, Hindu cosmological ideas, and Buddhist teachings into ports and royal courts across the region. Local rulers, and this is the crucial part, chose to adopt these ideas because they were politically useful. Hinduism and Buddhism both offered sophisticated frameworks for legitimizing royal authority. A king who styled himself as a manifestation of Vishnu or Shiva, or as a Chakravartin, a wheel-turning universal monarch in Buddhist thought, was not just being religious, he was making a political statement about the cosmic basis of his power. Think of it like a medieval European king invoking the divine right of kings. Same logic, different vocabulary. Here's a common MCQ trap. The exam may present answer choices suggesting that Southeast Asian rulers passively absorbed Indian culture under pressure or through conquest. Reject that answer every time. Indianization was largely a voluntary process driven by local elites seeking prestige and legitimacy. There was no Indian empire imposing Hinduism on the Khmer the way Rome imposed its institutions on conquered provinces. Trade and persuasion, not conquest, were the vectors. The Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire, centered in what is today Cambodia, flourished from roughly the 9th through the 15th centuries CE, with its height around 800 to 1200 CE. Its capital, Angkor, was one of the largest pre-industrial cities on Earth, home to perhaps 1 million people at its peak, fed by an extraordinary hydraulic engineering system of reservoirs called beres and canals that managed monsoon rainfall for rice cultivation across a vast floodplain. When you think about Angkor, think about how engineering and religion were inseparable. The massive temple complex of Angkor Wat, built in the 12th century under King Suryavarman II, was simultaneously a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, a symbolic representation of Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the Hindu universe, and a monument to royal power. It is the largest religious structure ever built. For the AP exam, you need to know that the Khmer Empire represents a synthesis of Hindu and later Buddhist traditions. By the late 12th and 13th centuries, under Jayavarman VII, the empire shifted more strongly toward Mahayana Buddhism, though Hindu elements never fully disappeared. This religious flexibility is itself a testable pattern. Southeast Asian kingdoms often blended Hindu and Buddhist practices simultaneously, rather than treating them as mutually exclusive. Don't fall into the trap of assuming a kingdom was purely one or the other. The Khmer also demonstrate the AP theme of state building through monumental architecture and agricultural surplus. Angkor's hydraulic system allowed enough rice production to support a large non-farming population, priests, artisans, soldiers, and administrators, which in turn sustained a complex hierarchical state. Connect this to your broader Unit 1 theme. Surplus agriculture is the foundation upon which complex societies and empires are built, from China to the Mongols to the Khmer. Srivijaya. If the Khmer were a land-based empire built on rice, Srivijaya was its maritime counterpart. Based on the island of Sumatra in modern Indonesia, Srivijaya dominated maritime trade through the Strait of Malacca, the narrow choke point between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, from roughly the 7th through the 13th centuries. Imagine Srivijaya as the ancient equivalent of a toll road operator sitting at the busiest intersection in the world. Every ship moving between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea had to pass through that strait, and Srivijaya extracted taxes and tribute from that traffic. Srivijaya was predominantly a Buddhist kingdom, and notably, it became a major center of Buddhist scholarship. The Chinese monk Yi Jing visited in the late 7th century and described it as a place where thousands of Buddhist monks studied Sanskrit texts. This is an important detail for the FRQ. Srivijaya illustrates how trade networks spread not just goods but ideas and religions across vast distances, a central theme of the AP World History course. The kingdom lacked the monumental temple architecture of the Khmer because its power was rooted in controlling sea lanes rather than agricultural land. That distinction, maritime versus agrarian basis of power, is a classic comparison question. Majapahit emerged in Java, also modern Indonesia, in the late 13th century, and reached its peak in the 14th century, representing perhaps the largest territorial claim of any Southeast Asian kingdom, stretching across much of the Indonesian archipelago and into the Malay Peninsula. Where Srivijaya had controlled trade through dominance of one strait, Majapahit sought to project power across a wider maritime network. It was a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom, and its court literature, particularly the Nagarakretagama, an epic poem from 1365 CE, is one of the richest primary sources we have for understanding pre-modern Southeast Asian statecraft and identity. A key AP connection here is continuity and change. Majapahit eventually declined in the 15th century, partly due to the spread of Islam into the region via Indian Ocean trade networks. This is your bridge forward in the course. The same trade routes that carried Hinduism and Buddhism into Southeast Asia would later carry Islam, and the gradual Islamization of maritime Southeast Asia, with the notable exception of Bali and parts of mainland Southeast Asia, is a major theme in later units. Don't think of these as separate stories. They're chapters in one ongoing narrative about how ideas travel along trade routes. Pulling it together for the exam. When you see a question about these kingdoms on the AP exam, anchor your thinking in 3 concepts: the voluntary, trade-driven nature of Indianization, the political function of Hindu and Buddhist ideology for legitimizing rulers, and the distinction between land-based, Khmer, and maritime-based, Srivijaya, Majapahit, power structures. These kingdoms are also your go-to examples whenever an FRQ asks you to demonstrate how cross-cultural interactions through trade produced cultural synthesis, a skill the AP exam rewards generously. As we move forward in Unit 1, we'll see similar patterns of cultural exchange and state-building playing out in other parts of the world, including the ways that Islam spread along analogous trade networks to shape the political and cultural landscape of sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. 1.3c Maritime trade networks and their role in spreading religion and culture. Let's talk about the ocean as a highway. That might sound strange, after all. When you picture a highway, you picture asphalt and lane markings, not salt water and monsoon winds. But here's the thing. Before there were interstate highways, before there were railroads, before there were airplanes, the most efficient way to move large quantities of goods, people, and ideas across long distances was water. And the civilizations that figured this out early, they changed the world. That's exactly what this section is about. The Indian Ocean Trade Network, the world's first superhighway. The Indian Ocean Trade Network is the single most important maritime system you need to know for the AP exam. It connected East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia in a web of commerce that was operating in full swing by roughly 1000 to 1200 CE, though its roots go back centuries earlier. Think of it like an ancient internet. Information, goods, and belief systems all traveled along the same route simultaneously. The engine driving this network was the monsoon wind system. This is a crucial technical term the College Board expects you to use precisely. Monsoon winds blow predictably northeast in winter and southwest in summer, which meant that merchants could literally plan their voyages around the calendar. A trader leaving the Arabian Peninsula would ride the winter monsoons eastward toward India, spend months there trading, and then catch the summer monsoons back home. The monsoons turned what could have been a terrifying gamble into a reliable, repeatable journey. This predictability is what made the Indian Ocean network so durable and so dense, with traffic over centuries. Now, here's where the culture and religion part becomes fascinating. When you put merchants in a foreign port for weeks or months waiting for the wind to change, something inevitable happens. They interact. They marry into local families. They set up permanent trading communities called diaspora communities, and they bring their religious practices with them. This is the mechanism the AP exam will ask you to explain over and over. Trade networks don't just move pepper and silk, they move ideas. How religion traveled on trade routes. Islam is the most exam-relevant example of a religion spread primarily through Indian Ocean trade. After the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE, Arab and Persian Muslim merchants became the dominant commercial players on the Indian Ocean. They didn't spread Islam by conquest along these sea routes. This is a critically important distinction and a very common trap on the MCQ section. Islam spread through voluntary conversion, often motivated by the commercial and social advantages of joining the network. Rulers in places like the Swahili coast of East Africa, cities like Kilwa and Mombasa, the Malay Peninsula, and the Indonesian archipelago converted to Islam in large part because doing so made them more trusted trading partners with Muslim merchants. It was practical as much as it was spiritual. Hinduism and Buddhism traveled the same Indian Ocean routes centuries earlier. Buddhist monks and traders from India brought Buddhism to Southeast Asia, where it took deep root in places like mainland Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. Hinduism spread to regions we now call Indonesia and Cambodia. The temple complex at Angkor Wat, originally a Hindu site, stands as one of the most dramatic physical legacies of this cultural diffusion. When you encounter a question about the Khmer Empire or early Southeast Asian kingdoms on the AP exam, remember that Indian Ocean trade is the reason South Asian cultural influence shows up so far from India. The Mediterranean and other maritime systems. While the Indian Ocean network gets the most exam attention in Unit 1, don't sleep on the Mediterranean Sea Trade Network, which was the connective tissue of the classical and post-classical Western world. The Mediterranean enabled the spread of Christianity across the Roman Empire and into North Africa and the Levant. It also facilitated the spread of Greek culture, what historians call Hellenism, under Alexander the Great's successors. Later, the Mediterranean would be the route by which the Black Death traveled from Central Asia through Crimea into Western Europe in the 14th century, which you'll revisit in Unit 2. The South China Sea and the East African coast are also exam-relevant subnetworks. Chinese junks, large, sophisticated sailing vessels, connected China to Southeast Asia and eventually to the Indian Ocean system. This is the context you need to understand Chinese maritime voyages, including the famous expeditions of Zheng He in the early 15th century, which you'll encounter in Unit 2. Those voyages didn't create the trade network. They were an extension of one that had existed for centuries. Diaspora communities and syncretism. Two terms you must own. Two vocabulary terms are absolutely essential here. First, diaspora communities. These are settlements of merchants far from their homeland who maintain their cultural and religious identity while living abroad. Arab-Muslim diaspora communities in East African port cities are the model example. Second, syncretism, the blending of religious or cultural practices. When Islam arrived in West Africa or Southeast Asia, it didn't simply replace what was there, it mixed. Local customs blended with Islamic practice, producing distinct regional forms of Islam. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand that cultural diffusion is rarely a one-way street. Common MCQ traps and FRQ answers. Watch out for questions that imply maritime trade caused religious conversion in a forcible or top-down way. The correct answer almost always emphasizes voluntary conversion and the social and commercial incentives involved. Also, be careful not to attribute the spread of Islam in Southeast Asia to overland Silk Road routes. In this region, it was maritime trade, not overland trade, doing the heavy lifting. For free response questions, the College Board's rubric will reward you for making the mechanism explicit. Don't just say trade spread Islam, say Muslim merchants established diaspora communities in Indian Ocean port cities, and local rulers converted to Islam to facilitate trade relationships, resulting in the spread of Islamic culture and practice. That causal chain is what earns points. This topic connects directly to Unit 2, where you'll see how the same Indian Ocean and Mediterranean networks accelerate in the 1200 to 1450 period, carrying not only religion and culture but also plague, new agricultural products, and the economic power of the Mongol Empire's Pax Mongolica, so keep these maritime routes fresh in your mind as we move forward. 1.3D Interactions between Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam in South and Southeast Asia. Setting the stage, why this topic matters. Imagine you move into a neighborhood that already has a strong cultural identity, established customs, community institutions, a shared way of life. Now imagine another community moves in next door, and then another. Do they fight constantly? Do they ignore each other? Or do they borrow recipes, blend traditions, and create something entirely new? That's essentially what happened across South and Southeast Asia between roughly 600 and 1450 CE, and the AP exam loves to test whether you understand the nuance of those interactions. It's never as simple as religion, a conquered religion B. The reality is messier, more interesting, and far more important. The landscape before Islam arrives. To understand the interactions, you first need to know what was already there. By the time Islam began spreading into South Asia in the 8th century, Hinduism and Buddhism had been coexisting, sometimes peacefully, sometimes competitively, for well over 1,000 years. Think of Hinduism as the deep-rooted oak tree in the yard, with its caste system, devotional practices like bhakti, and a decentralized, flexible theological tradition. Buddhism, born as a reform movement within that same soil, had spread dramatically under rulers like Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, and had become the dominant tradition across much of Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and parts of Central Asia. Here's a critical point the AP exam will probe. Buddhism in South Asia was actually in decline by the time Islam arrived. It had been gradually reabsorbed into Hinduism through a process of syncretism. Hindus even incorporated the Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu, essentially folding their competitor into their own theological framework. That's the kind of sophisticated religious adaptation you need to be able to explain on an FRQ. Islam enters South Asia, the Delhi Sultanate and beyond. Islam arrived in South Asia through two main channels, and the AP exam distinguishes between them. The first was military conquest. Arab forces reached the Sindh region in the early 8th century, and later Turkic forces established the Delhi Sultanate in 1206. The second, and arguably more culturally significant, was trade. Muslim merchants had been sailing the Indian Ocean trade routes for centuries, and through those commercial relationships, Islam took root in coastal communities long before any army arrived. You'll want to connect this directly to Unit 2, Networks of Exchange, because the Indian Ocean trading system is the engine behind so much of this religious spread. Now, here's where students commonly make a mistake. They assume that Muslim rulers forcibly converted the Hindu and Buddhist populations. The reality is far more complicated. The Delhi sultans and later the Mughal emperors generally practiced what historians call a policy of dimitude for Hindu subjects, meaning non-Muslims could practice their faith in exchange for paying a special tax called the jizya. Mass forced conversion was the exception, not the rule. The AP exam will absolutely try to trap you with an oversimplified Islam destroyed Hinduism in India narrative. Don't fall for it. Syncretism, the Bhakti and Sufi connection. The most exam-critical concept in this entire section is syncretism, and the best example of it is the remarkable convergence between the Bhakti movement within Hinduism and Sufism within Islam. This is a connection that scores points on FRQs and separates students who truly understand the material from those who've only memorized surface facts. Bhakti was a devotional movement emphasizing a direct, intensely personal relationship with a deity, bypassing priests, rituals, and caste distinctions. Sufi Islam similarly emphasized a mystical, personal connection with God, often through music, poetry, and ecstatic practice rather than rigid legal observance. When Sufi missionaries spread into South Asia, ordinary people recognized the emotional and spiritual resonance between these two traditions. Poets like Kabir, born in the 15th century, explicitly wove together Hindu and Islamic ideas in their work, declaring that God was beyond all names and labels. Kabir is your go-to example for syncretic literature on the AP exam. Remember him. The practical result was that many lower caste Hindus found Islam genuinely appealing, partly because Islamic theology rejected the caste hierarchy. This is a nuanced causation argument. Conversion often had social and economic dimensions, not just spiritual ones. If an FRQ asks you to explain why some communities converted, you need to go beyond Muslim rulers were powerful and address the social liberation angle. Southeast Asia. A different story. Shift your mental map to Southeast Asia, and the dynamic changes meaningfully. Here, Hinduism and Buddhism had both spread primarily through peaceful cultural diffusion along trade routes, the Silk Roads, and especially the Indian Ocean network. The Kingdom of Funan, the Khmer Empire, and the Srivijaya Empire all blended Hindu and Buddhist practices in ways that were thoroughly localized. Angkor Wat, built in the 12th century by the Khmer, is your anchor example here. It was originally a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, then later converted to Buddhist use. That single monument encapsulates the fluid, syncretic nature of religious identity in Southeast Asia. Islam came to Southeast Asia later, primarily through merchant networks by the 13th and 14th centuries, and again the spread was largely peaceful and commercial rather than military. The island trading states, especially in the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago, converted partly because it facilitated trade connections with the vast Muslim mercantile network stretching from Arabia to East Africa. Rulers converted first, then populations followed. This is a classic AP world pattern: political and economic motives driving religious transformation. Common exam traps and FRQ scoring points. Watch out for these specific traps. First, don't conflate the experience of South Asia with Southeast Asia. The pathways of Islamic spread were different, and the AP exam rewards that distinction. Second, avoid the trap of treating these religions as monolithic. Hinduism in 1200 CE looked very different from place to place, and the same is true of Buddhism and Islam. Third, when you see a document about religious tolerance or coexistence in this era, don't overcorrect into claiming everything was perfectly harmonious. Conflict and destruction of temples absolutely occurred, particularly during military campaigns. For FRQ rubrics, strong responses will demonstrate continuity and change over time, argue causation with specificity, and use precise vocabulary, syncretism, bhakti, Sufism, jizya, dhimmi, cultural diffusion, and the names of specific empires and figures. Connections to other units. This topic threads through the entire course. It connects backward to Unit 1's earlier discussion of how religion spread through trade and conquest, and forward to Unit 3 and 4, where you'll see how Mughal rulers like Akbar attempt to formalize religious synthesis through his short-lived Din-i-Ilahi philosophy. The broader pattern, trade routes as conduits for cultural and religious exchange, is essentially the thesis of Unit 2. With the interactions between these three great traditions now firmly in your mind, you're perfectly positioned to zoom out and examine how those same trade networks carried not just ideas and faith, but goods, diseases, and technologies across the entire globe, which is exactly where we're headed next. 1.4 State building in the Americas from C-120 to C-1450. Setting the stage, the Americas before European contact. Let's do a quick mental exercise. Imagine you're a College Board exam writer and you want to test whether students understand that powerful, sophisticated civilizations existed across the globe, not just in Eurasia and Africa. Where do you look? You look at the Americas, and specifically at this 250-year window between roughly 1200 and 1450. What you find there should genuinely impress you, because the state building happening in Mesoamerica, the Andes, and North America during this period rivals anything happening in the Old World at the same time. Your job for the AP exam is to know not just what these civilizations built, but how and why, the mechanisms of power, the justifications for authority, and the systems that held everything together. The Aztec Mexica Empire, tribute, ideology, and expansion. The civilization you absolutely must know cold is the Aztec Empire, which the College Board almost always refers to using both names, Aztec and Mexica, so be comfortable with both. By the early 1300s, the Mexica had settled on an island in Lake Texcoco and founded Tenochtitlan, a city that would eventually become one of the largest urban centers in the entire world. But here's the key concept. The AP exam loves to test. The Aztecs did not govern through direct administration the way the Roman Empire did. Instead, they used a tribute system. Think of it like a protection racket on a civilizational scale. Conquered peoples were allowed to keep their local rulers and customs, but they owed the Aztec capital goods, labor, and loyalty. Cacao, textiles, jade, warriors for sacrifice. It all flowed inward to Tenochtitlan. This brings us to the ideological glue that held the empire together. Religion and warfare were inseparable. The Aztec cosmology held that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the sun, and that humans owed a blood debt in return. This meant constant warfare wasn't just political ambition, it was a cosmic obligation. The practice of flower wars, ritual conflicts designed specifically to capture rather than kill enemies, gave the empire a theological justification for perpetual military expansion. On the AP exam, when you see a question about how the Aztecs legitimized their authority, the answer involves both military power and religious ideology working together. Don't pick one at the expense of the other. The political structure worth memorizing is the Triple Alliance. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan joined forces around 1428 to dominate the region. The exam sometimes frames this as a confederation rather than a single unified state, and that distinction matters. When an FRQ asks you to describe Aztec political organization, mentioning the Triple Alliance and the tribute-based, rather than directly administered structure, will earn you rubric points. The Inca Empire, bureaucracy, mita, and environmental mastery. Now, let's fly south to the Andes, because the Inca Empire is the other civilization the AP exam tests consistently. The Inca state, known as Tawantinsuyu, meaning the Four Regions, was actually a much more centrally administered empire than the Aztecs, and that contrast is something exam writers love to exploit. Where the Aztecs collected tribute and left local governance mostly intact, the Inca built an astonishing bureaucratic infrastructure. They had a road system stretching over 25,000 miles, longer than the modern U.S. interstate highway system, running through some of the most extreme terrain on Earth. The labor system that made this possible was called mita, and it's a term you need to know precisely. Mita was a form of labor taxation. Every household owed the state a certain amount of work time per year. In exchange, the state stored food in vast storehouses called cuilcas and redistributed it during famines or military campaigns. Think of it as a social contract written in potatoes and labor rather than paper and ink. This reciprocal labor obligation distinguished the Inca system from outright slavery, and the AP exam will sometimes present answer choices that conflate the two. Don't fall for it. The Inca also achieved remarkable agricultural innovation through terraced farming, called andines, which allowed them to cultivate crops on near-vertical mountain slopes. This is worth noting because it connects to a broader AP World theme, how civilizations adapt their state-building strategies to their environments. In Eurasia, you might see hydraulic empires built around river irrigation. In the Andes, you see vertical integration of ecological zones. North America, the Mississippian culture, and Cahokia. Here's where many students leave points on the table: North America. The College Board expects you to know about the Mississippian culture in its most spectacular expression. Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis. By around 1100 CE, Cahokia had a population of perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people, making it larger than contemporary London. The city was organized around massive earthen mounds. The largest, Monk's Mound, contains more earth by volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is a great exam day fact because it immediately signals complexity and sophistication. Cahokia's political structure was that of a chiefdom, a hierarchical society led by a paramount chief who derived authority from both religious and political roles. Mississippian societies used maize agriculture as their economic foundation, which is a critical link to the broader AP World theme of agriculture, enabling population growth and political complexity. One common MCQ trap is assuming North American societies were universally nomadic or stateless. Cahokia demolishes that assumption entirely. Connecting it all, themes, traps, and the bigger picture. The thread running through all three civilizations is this. Agriculture generates surplus. Surplus enables specialization and enables hierarchy, and hierarchy enables state building. Whether you're talking about Aztec chinampas, the famous floating gardens that boosted food production in Lake Texcoco, Inca terracing in the Andes, or Mississippian maize fields along the river valleys, the economic foundation matters. For FRQs, the most commonly tested skill is comparison, comparing state-building strategies across regions. When you compare the Aztecs and Inca, lead with the contrast between tribute-based indirect rule and Mita-based direct administration. When you compare either Mesoamerican or Andean civilizations to those in Unit 2's Mongol Empire or China, focus on the shared use of labor mobilization, religious legitimation of power, and monumental architecture as tools of statecraft. The biggest exam trap in this section is Eurocentrism by omission, assuming that because these civilizations had no writing system that the AP tests, the Inca used quipus knotted cords for record-keeping, not alphabetic script, they were somehow less organized or less powerful. That assumption will cost you points every time. With the Americas grounded in your mind, we're ready to move across the Pacific and examine how the great land-based empires of East and Southeast Asia were consolidating their own forms of political power during this same dynamic period. 14A, the Aztec, Mexica, Empire, tributary system, political structure, and religion. Let's talk about one of the most fascinating and complex civilizations the world has ever seen, the Aztec Empire, which the people themselves called the Mexica. If you've ever watched a mob movie where a powerful boss collects protection money from every business in the neighborhood, you already understand the basic logic of how this empire worked. The Aztecs were masters of political power, and understanding them is absolutely essential for your AP World History exam. Who were the Mexica? First, let's get the terminology right, because the AP exam loves to test this. The people you know as Aztecs called themselves the Mexica, pronounced Mexica. Aztec is actually a term applied later by historians. On the AP exam, you may see either term, and you need to recognize both refer to the same people. The Mexica established their capital city of Tenochtitlan around 1325 CE on an island in Lake Texcoco in central Mexico, an engineering marvel built on a swamp, connected to the mainland by massive causeways. Picture Venice, but larger and more deliberately constructed for defense and trade. The Mexica rose to dominance in the early 15th century, and by the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519, their empire encompassed millions of people across Mesoamerica. How they built and maintained that empire is exactly what the AP exam wants you to understand. The tributary system, the engine of the empire. Here's the single most important economic and political concept you need to understand about the Aztec Empire, the tributary system. Rather than governing every conquered territory directly with their own bureaucrats and soldiers stationed everywhere, the Mexica used a much more efficient strategy. They conquered a city-state or region, left the local rulers largely in place, and demanded regular payments of tribute, goods, labor, and sometimes people, in exchange for being allowed to keep governing themselves. Think of it like a franchise model. The Mexica were corporate headquarters, local rulers were franchise owners who kept running their businesses day to day, but they had to send a percentage of everything to headquarters on a regular schedule. Tribute goods included cotton textiles, cacao, the basis of chocolate, jade, feathers, gold, obsidian tools, food, and much more. These goods flowed into Tenochtitlan and fueled the empire's economy, fed its armies, and funded its monumental architecture. This is a critical point for the AP exam. The Aztec tributary system meant political incorporation without full cultural assimilation. Conquered peoples maintained their own languages, gods, and local governance. They just had to pay up. This is fundamentally different from, say, the way the Mongols or later European colonial powers would govern territories. The exam frequently asks you to compare imperial systems, and you must be able to articulate this distinction clearly. When you see an FRQ asking you to compare the Aztec Empire with the Mongol Empire or the Ottoman Empire, your tributary system knowledge is your anchor. Political structure, the pyramid, beneath the pyramid. The Aztec political structure was hierarchical in a way that almost mirrors the architecture of their famous temples, wider at the base, narrowing toward a single point at the top. At the apex sat the Tlatoani, the ruler, often translated as speaker, with the supreme ruler carrying the title Huey Tlatoani, or Great Speaker Moctezuma II, who was ruling when Cortez arrived, held this position. Below the Tlatoani sat the noble class, the Pipiltan, who controlled land, administered governance, and led military campaigns. Further down came the commoner class, the Maishwaltan, who farmed, traded, and served in the military, and at the very bottom sat slaves, often people captured in war or those who had fallen into debt. One nuance the AP exam loves to probe: Aztec leadership was not strictly hereditary in the European sense. The Huey Tlatoani was selected by a council of nobles from among the ruling family's eligible candidates. This is an important distinguishing detail. Also pay attention to the role of the Kalpuli, local community units organized around family groups that managed land distribution, labor, and local schooling. The Kalpuli functioned as the administrative backbone of commoner life, and understanding it helps you explain how the empire held together at the ground level. Religion, the cosmic engine. You cannot understand Aztec civilization without understanding its religion, and the AP exam will absolutely test this. Aztec religion was polytheistic and deeply integrated with politics, agriculture, and warfare. The gods were not distant or abstract, they were constantly hungry, and humans were responsible for feeding them. The most important concept here is human sacrifice understood within its own cultural logic. The Aztecs believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the current world, which they understood as the fifth sun, and humanity owed a cosmic debt in return. Sacrifice, including human sacrifice, was understood as a sacred obligation to keep the sun moving, the rains coming, and the world from collapsing. The Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, the great double temple dedicated to the war god Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc, was the center of this cosmic maintenance. This belief system had enormous political consequences. The Mexica conducted flower wars, ritualized conflicts with neighboring states, specifically designed to capture enemies for sacrifice, rather than to kill them outright or fully conquer their territory. Some neighboring peoples, like the Tlaxcalans, were kept as perennial enemies precisely to serve this purpose. The Tlaxcalans later allied with Cortez for this very reason. They resented Aztec domination intensely. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. A trap you will almost certainly encounter. Do not confuse the tributary system with a system of direct colonial rule. The Aztecs did not dismantle local governance or impose a single culture. This made their empire both powerful and vulnerable, since conquered peoples had every incentive to rebel or defect when a stronger challenger arrived. Another common mistake is describing Aztec sacrifice as purely barbaric without contextualizing it within their cosmological worldview. The AP exam rewards nuanced, context-aware analysis. For FRQs, if you're asked about state building or methods of imperial control, always connect the tributary system to both the empire's strengths, efficient extraction of wealth, and its weaknesses, limited loyalty among subject peoples. That dual analysis is what earns you the complexity point on the DBQ or LEQ rubric. Connecting to the broader course, the Aztec Empire connects powerfully to several other units. In Unit 1, you'll compare it with other regional powers like the Mali Empire or the Ming Dynasty, all of which had their own methods of consolidating political authority. In Unit 4, the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs becomes a pivotal moment in the story of European colonialism, and understanding the tributary system and internal tensions among subject peoples explains why Tenochtitlan fell so quickly. The story of the Aztecs is never really just about one empire. It's about the forces of human ambition, religious belief, and economic extraction that show up across civilizations throughout history. Coming up next, we'll turn to the other great empire of the pre-Columbian Americas, the Inca, and you'll be amazed by just how differently they solved the same basic problem of holding together a massive, diverse empire. 1-4b, the Inca Empire. Mita labor system, administrative structures, and quipu. Let's talk about one of the most impressive empires you'll ever study, and one that the AP exam loves to test. The Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu, meaning Land of the Four Quarters, stretched roughly 2,500 miles along the western coast of South America at its height in the early 1500s. No wheels, no iron tools, no written language in the conventional sense, and yet the Inca built roads that rival anything Rome constructed, administered millions of people across impossible mountain terrain, and developed a labor system so sophisticated that historians still debate its finer details. If that doesn't impress you, nothing will. The Mita labor system. Here's the concept you absolutely must have locked down for the exam. Mita. The College Board will test this directly, and students lose points constantly by misunderstanding what it actually was. Mita was not slavery. Say that again out loud if you need to. It was a labor tax, a rotational obligatory service that every able-bodied adult male in the empire owed to the state for a portion of the year. Think of it like mandatory community service, except instead of picking up litter in a park, you might be building Machu Picchu. Here's the analogy that makes it stick. Imagine your town has no money, no currency, no cash economy at all, but the roads need building and the army needs feeding. So instead of taxing you in coins, the government says, give us 3 months of your labor. That's Mita. In exchange, the state fed you, clothed you, and provided tools while you worked. This is what historians call a reciprocal obligation. The Inca state gave something back, which is part of what made the system politically stable rather than just brutally exploitative. The Mita supported everything: construction of roads and bridges, military service, work in state-owned mines and fields, and labor on monumental architecture like temples and administrative centers. The state also maintained vast storehouses called kolkas, filled with food, textiles, and weapons, all produced and managed through Mita labor. This is your connection to the broader AP theme of state building and how empires extract resources from their populations. The Mita is a perfect example of what the College Board calls methods of state control. The most common MCQ trap here is confusing Mita with slavery, or with the later colonial Spanish adaptation of the same word. The Spanish colonizers borrowed the term Mita and used it to force indigenous labor into silver mines under brutal conditions. That is a totally different beast. If an exam question mentions colonial silver mining at Potosi and uses the word Mita, that's Spanish colonial coercion, not the reciprocal Inca system. Context is everything. Administrative structures. Now let's zoom out and look at how the Inca actually ran this enormous empire. The key word for the exam is decentralized administration with centralized authority, and you need to understand what that means. At the top sat the Sapa Inca, the divine emperor believed to be a son of the sun god Inti. Below him, the empire was divided into 4 large regions called Suyas, hence Land of the Four Quarters, each administered by a governor, often a member of the royal family or Inca nobility. These regions were subdivided further all the way down to local community units called Islas, which were kinship-based groups responsible for organizing labor and resources at the village level. Think of it like a corporate org chart. The Sapa Inca is the CEO. Regional governors are regional vice presidents. Local Caracas, that's the term for local leaders the Inca co-opted into their system, are your middle managers. The IWLU is the actual work team on the ground. the College Board loves the concept of indirect rule, and the Inca are a textbook example. Rather than replacing every local leader with an Inca official, they often kept existing elites in place as long as those elites swore loyalty and delivered mita labor. This reduced resistance and made administration cheaper. The famous road network, the Tapak-Eon, was the physical backbone of all this administration. Over 24,000 miles of roads connected the empire. Relay runners called chasquis carried messages and goods at speeds that seem almost unbelievable across mountain passes. This road system is directly comparable to what Rome built. Both were tools of imperial control, military logistics, and economic integration. That comparison will show up on the exam. The quipu. This is where things get genuinely fascinating, and where the AP exam gets tricky. A quipu, sometimes spelled kipu, was a recording device made of knotted strings, different colors of string, different types of knots, different positions of knots along the string, all encoded information. Quipus recorded census data, tax records, tribute amounts, military rosters, and calendar information. They were essentially the Inca's version of a spreadsheet. The critical point for the exam is this. The quipu was not a written language in the way College Board defines writing. It was a mnemonic and record-keeping device, likely numerical at its core, though some researchers believe certain quipus encoded narrative information. When the exam asks about the Inca's lack of a writing system, the correct answer acknowledges the quipu as a sophisticated alternative, not as a traditional alphabet or script. Students lose points by either dismissing the quipu entirely or overclaiming that it was equivalent to written language. Precision matters here. Specialists trained to read and create quipus were called quipucamayos. Their expertise made them essential bureaucrats, the accountants and record keepers of the empire. When Spanish colonizers arrived and destroyed much of Inca culture, the loss of trained quipucamayos meant that most quipus became unreadable, which is why we still can't fully decode them today. Connecting to the bigger picture, for your FRQ responses, always tie the Inca back to the unit's central question. How did states consolidate and expand power in this period? Your answer should weave together mita as a method of resource extraction, the road network and administrative hierarchy as tools of control, and the quipu as a technology that made large-scale governance possible without conventional literacy. These three elements work together as a system, and the exam rewards students who see that coherence. Also watch for comparison questions. The College Board frequently asks you to compare the Inca to other land-based empires of this era, the Aztec tribute system versus mita labor, the Ottoman Empire, or the Mali Empire. The key distinction is always the reciprocal labor tax model versus tribute extraction or direct taxation in currency. With the Inca firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to move into the broader patterns of cross-cultural exchange and trade networks that will define Unit 2, because soon we'll see how these powerful land-based empires came into contact with, and were ultimately transformed by, the expanding global connections of the 1400s and beyond. 1.4c North American societies, Mississippian culture and Pueblo peoples. Setting the scene. North America before 1200 CE. Let's talk about something that surprises almost every student the first time they really dig into it. North America before European contact was not empty, it was not simple, and it was absolutely not primitive. When you're sitting with your AP exam in front of you and you see a question about pre-Columbian North America, I want you to think of two civilizations in particular that College Board loves to test: the Mississippian culture of the eastern woodlands and the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest. These two societies are brilliant case studies in how environment shapes civilization, and understanding them deeply will earn you points on both the multiple choice and the free response. The Mississippian culture, cities of earth and ceremony. Imagine you're standing on a flat floodplain in what is today southern Illinois, around the year 1100 CE. You look up and see a massive earthen platform, roughly the size of the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, rising over 100 feet into the sky. Around it are dozens of smaller mounds, thousands of people, and a sophisticated urban layout. This is Cahokia, the crown jewel of Mississippian civilization, and at its peak it held somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. That made it, for a time, one of the largest cities in the world. Let that sink in when you're tempted to think of North America as sparsely populated before Europeans arrived. The Mississippian culture thrived roughly from 800 CE to 1600 CE across a broad swath of the American Southeast and Midwest. Think the Mississippi River Valley and its tributaries. The defining feature of this culture, and the term College Board wants you to use precisely, is mound building. These mounds were not random piles of dirt. They were deliberate architectural projects serving as platforms for temples, elite residences, and ceremonial spaces. The society that built them was hierarchical, meaning social stratification was real and visible. A chieftain class sat at the top, and archaeological evidence, burial goods like copper ornaments, exotic shells, and finely worked ceramics, tells us that elites had access to trade goods from hundreds of miles away. This is the Mississippian Exchange Network, sometimes called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, and it stretched across an enormous geographic area. The economic foundation of Mississippian society was maize agriculture. Here is where you connect this topic back to Unit 1's broader theme of how agricultural surpluses support complex societies. Maize, which had originally been domesticated in Mesoamerica, diffused northward over centuries. Once Mississippian peoples adopted more productive maize cultivation around 900 to 1000 CE, population density increased, surplus food supported non-farming specialists, and that surplus enabled the labor mobilization needed to build those enormous mounds. This is a cause and effect chain. College Board will absolutely test. Agricultural surplus leads to specialization, leads to social complexity, leads to monumental architecture. Trace that chain and you'll nail the contextualization point on an